all of the answers for everything that we're looking at for social and emotional learning. So we really wanted to choose a name that would be representative of all people across the globe. When we were coming together and really working hard at trying to figure out what it would be, the word Karanga came up because at the time there was the instance of terrorist attack in New Zealand. At that time, we had an amazing leader, our leader in the country. Most of you will know the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She did an amazing job at really showing kindness, showing real caring and showing real understanding of the need for well-being and social and emotional understanding of each other. At that time, when I came and spoke to all of the team who were sitting in Salzburg at the Salzburg Global Seminar meeting, I kept saying to everybody, she's doing a karanga to the world. She's waking up the world. She's saying you don't have to be the way it's always been. You can treat people with kindness and respect. And so by the end of the time that we were talking at the meeting, that word came really strongly through as the name of our group, because we wanted to wake the world up and say, we don't have to always do things the way we've done them before. So I think for me, it was a really powerful name. Because it's a name that belongs to Māori, because it's a name that belongs to Indigenous, it's not a name that anybody can just take and use. So for me, it was really important to consult with my elders and to consult with us, actually with the spiritual realm as well, to make sure that this name could be gifted to this group. And I just wanted to confirm and let everyone know that we've done that. And it's with great honour that that name was gifted to our group to use, because we do really understand the importance of cultural identity, cultural language, and the fact that we're really respectful of each other. And to that end, I wanted to share that story about Karanga, because for me, it's really important that everybody understands that we have been gifted this name, and it's a really very special name. And the idea is that we're waking everybody up to say, we don't have to be in the world the way we've been before. We can change how it looks. I wanted to share that story because I wanted just to reiterate a couple of comments that our first keynote speaker said at the beginning of session 1 this morning. She made 3 really clear points, and her name is Apana Ray. And I really do encourage you to have a look at her recording if you get a chance to do that. She talked about context really matters, and that localization is really, really important. And the fact that, a lot of the time we see speakers from Global North in a lot of situations, we've really worked hard at Karanga to make sure that we get a really wide representation of people from all over the world and who can speak from a different viewpoint. So we're really excited to be able to share a lot of those people with you today, but we're also looking for more people. We're also looking to find out, where is that great practice around the world? Where is it happening locally? The second one she talked about was we need to have some really tough conversations with each other. We need to be honest, we need to be open, and we really need to recognise that social and emotional learning is not just a tag name. It's actually a really serious business, and we can't go roughshod over racism, we can't go roughshod over sexism, we can't go roughshod over anything. It's not a symbol for anything else. We must really be clear about that. This is really dealing with the real root causes of some of our society's big issues. And social and emotional learning is an avenue to support that, but it's not the sole thing that we are doing to make a difference in our world. Then the third one was really about how can educators be an ally for young people, and how can we do that? And really it's about sharing the power. It's about sharing our voice with other people, believing that we don't have the answers for everything and that young people have the answers for a lot of the things we're struggling with. And it's also about making sure that we recognise that there is a limited amount of resources in the world, and that there are going to be some people who may have to give up some things. And I think that's a really challenging thing for us to consider. So I leave you with those challenging thoughts as we begin our session this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you may be in the world. But really consider why are we looking at SEL, and how important is that to our world? But to recognise that the call has been given, the Karanga call has been given to the world, to wake up, to change, to become a world where we all want to live. So it's with great pleasure that I pass you across to Dominic, who's going to introduce our first keynote speaker for this afternoon's session. Thank you very much, Dominic.
Thanks, Jojo, and thanks, Mark and Matt. My name's Dominic Regester, and I'm a Programme Director at Salzburg Global Seminar, and also part of the Executive Committee for Karanga. Let me add my welcome to this SEL conference. I read a great blog recently about online convening, and specifically about active listening in online engagements, and it included a brilliant definition of active listening taken from immersive theatre practice. Go into the experience with the intention of being changed by what will be said. Now, there are about 200 of us joining this part of the conference across multiple platforms at the moment, and what we're going to hear and learn over the next few hours has the potential to change us all. As we're well aware, we're in the midst of a moment of great and profound change. There is the global crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has the potential to change education systems for the better. And there are the protests against racial injustice and discrimination inspired in many countries around the world by the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA. Now, All of us involved with Karanga and at SEL and Edu and at Committee for Children believe that social and emotional learning has a key role to play in helping build back better education systems after the pandemic and in addressing longer-term structural societal issues around racial injustice. These will be two of the major themes running throughout today's conference. Social and emotional learning cannot happen without context, be that national or local, socio-political or racial context, and the adaptation and contextualization are crucial to social and emotional learning interventions achieving their full potential. Crises can in many ways act as fuel for the imagination, and in amongst all of the trauma and fear and anxiety and anger around the world at the moment, there are some grounds for optimism. Progress is being made in the fight against injustice in many places, and we're starting to see a new understanding or consensus emerge that focuses on a different kind of purpose for education, one that emphasizes empathy and compassion, amongst other things, behaviors which are, of course, the bedrock of many SEL programs. Analysis from UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report has shown that in the first 100 days of this year, 90% of learners worldwide had their education disrupted, and 188 countries had shut down their school systems. This is unprecedented, and the fact that it is happening at the same time as a concerted wave of protest against injustice creates a space for creating education systems and societies that are fairer and that are desperately needed for our much more interconnected, globalized world. Now, a minute ago, I mentioned UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, and it's now my very great honor to introduce the second keynote speaker in today's conference, Manos Antoninis, the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report. Manos, thank you so much for joining us today during what must be one of the busiest weeks of the year for you. The 2020 GEM report, Inclusion and Education, All Means All, was published exactly a week ago today. The theme, Inclusion and Education, All Means All, was chosen a long time ago, but it could not be more relevant to the current moment. And issues of inclusion and equity have come up repeatedly during the earlier part of this conference. Manos joined the GEM report team in August 2011 from Oxford Policy Management and has worked as a monitoring and evaluation expert in education sector projects across many different topics and in many different parts of the world. And he's going to speak for about 15 minutes now, sharing highlights and key findings from the report. And after that, we'll have a bit of a question and answer session. So please post questions for Manos in the chat on Zoom, and we will try and address as many of them as possible in the time that we have available. So Manos, over to you. And thank you again for being with us.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. I will give this a general presentation of the topic of the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report. I think you will make your thoughts if you do the active listening to see the linking points with social and emotional learning, but I can come back to that at the end to draw the lines that connect these points. But as I share my screen, just to let you know, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Global Education Monitoring Report, that it is the tool of the international community for monitoring progress on education in the international agenda, and that is the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular the fourth goal that is focusing on education, an agenda that is to be achieved by 2030. And we are an editorially independent team, hosted and published by UNESCO. So we have quite a unique status since 2002 in reporting on progress in education globally. And the theme of the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on inclusion was specifically chosen because ultimately the theme of inclusion is ingrained in the SDG 4 formulation. Countries have committed to achieve SDG 4, which includes inclusive education. Sorry, I'm just trying to playing with remote control. Sorry, I'm stopping for a moment because I thought I would be able to move easily. Ah, yeah, okay, that's fine. So countries subscribe to SDG 4 and its commitment to inclusive education, but it's fair to say that for many, it was not entirely clear what they were signing up to. We refer to inclusion in this report as a process that embraces diversity and builds a sense of belonging to achieve social cohesion. These actions are rooted, or should be rooted, in the belief that every learner matters, has value and potential. It is about neither discriminating against nor rejecting anyone. It's about adapting to learners, making accommodations. It's not about learners adapting to the system. The case for inclusion, and that's where sometimes the confusion arises, has come from the persistent efforts of those supporting the rights of persons with disabilities over the years, who ensured the right to inclusive education to be enshrined in international law in 2006. But inclusion, and that's a key message of the report, is not about one group. And you saw this animation highlighting the different groups that we have in mind. The mindset and the mechanisms that generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those excluded. Every society needs to own up to the mechanisms that they have to exclude. And unfortunately, identity, background, and ability do dictate education opportunities. First of all, any discussion on inclusion, and that's you have to remember, we're taking a global perspective, has to start from the fact that 258 million children, adolescents, and youth around the world are out of school. They were out of school before the current pandemic and the school closures. In 12 countries, with data that was collected just a couple of years ago, children with disabilities were found to have 2.5 times higher chance of never, ever going to school than those without disabilities. Adolescent refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school. The world set a target for all to complete secondary education, a target that we know is not achieved even in high-income countries. And yet, in at least 20 countries, not a single poor rural girl was completing secondary school. Among those who do complete lower secondary school, the richest students are 2 times more likely to learn basic skills than the poorest. Halving learning poverty, which has been a term popularized by the World Bank, which is a softer version of the international commitment to eradicate learning poverty, requires thinking about much more than just teaching techniques how to read. It requires thinking about students' experience and well-being, and here is a key link to today's conference. Stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination are actually alienating many millions more inside classrooms, making it much more difficult to progress through education. LGBTI students in the United States are 3 times more likely to stay home from school because of feeling unsafe. Grade 4 students all over the world in middle and high-income countries who are not learning in their home language are at least 1/3 less likely to learn their basic reading skills. And COVID-19, as you just heard, has just added a new layer of complexity. Of course, there has been a lot of focus on online solutions to learning continuity, many of which have been inspiring. But we know for sure that they offer only a partial substitute for the education experience. Disadvantaged students have been the least likely to benefit because they lack the right device, they lack the right connection to the internet with the right speed at the right price, or they don't have the appropriate learning environment in order to learn. Teachers lost touch with 8% of students in France within the first 3 weeks of the pandemic. And if we think in truly global terms, even these opportunities have been the exception. Only 12% of households in the least developed countries have internet access at home. Even low-tech solutions are not working. Among the poorest households in Ethiopia, only 7% have a radio. None have a television. So let us not forget that for hundreds of millions, learning simply stopped. And some may not go back to school if the family, as we fear and predict, may be plunged deeper into poverty. Education systems reacted, generally speaking, but the report shows that 40% of low and lower middle income countries had no response that targeted the disadvantaged students. There is one key recommendation, overarching recommendations for all those involved in education under the theme of inclusion. Inclusion cannot be achieved if it is seen as inconvenience or if people harbor the belief that children's capacity to learn is fixed. The report calls on all countries to widen the understanding of inclusive education to encompass all learners, regardless of identity, background, or ability. The report is for everyone. We cover the albinos in sub-Saharan Africa, the stateless in Arab countries, the Roma in Europe, the displaced Rohingya in Asia, the Afro-descendants in Latin America. Yet many governments do not base their laws and policies on this principle. The report found, after reviewing all countries' laws and policies, that only 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education. And of those, only 57% cover anything that multiple marginalized groups. Mostly, they tend to focus on one group in the population. Interventions should also be coherent from early childhood to adulthood. And when I make the links with social and emotional learning, I can say a bit more about that. Inclusion is not costly by definition. Simple gestures and ways to manage a classroom cost nothing, and yet are the most valuable contributions to inclusion. Still, efforts need to be made to ensure that we get equity and inclusion rights through appropriate funding mechanisms. There are two parts to this story. First, education ministries tend to allocate general funding equally to local authorities or schools, which is politically simpler, but it does not take the disadvantage of some into account. Second, education ministries need to not only to look at their own budget, but also the budget of other social ministries that can help target students and families in need. Social protection programs in Latin America over the years have increased attainment of education by 1.5 years. There is no ideal funding mechanism because countries differ in their understanding of inclusion, in their history, and in their levels of decentralization. But increasingly, we see countries moving away from assigning funding specifically to each need separately, because that tends to inflate the total cost. They tend to give more general funding to schools and districts and let them decide how it is best to share this funding. And there is this other dimension which is related when we talk about financing inclusive education. The overall objective of inclusion, as we have known it, is to ensure that every child attends the local school and studies alongside all other children in the neighborhood. But laws in 25% of countries, as the report shows, expect children with disabilities to be educated in separate settings. Another 48% call for at least partial segregation. Moving from where we're now to ensuring that all schools cater for every children's needs, including those with severe disabilities, is not a small feat. In many ways, it is a management and a planning challenge. A legacy of segregation means that human and other resources to support diversity have been concentrated in just a few places and are unequally distributed. So we need mechanisms and incentives to share specialist resources and ensure that such expertise supports all mainstream schools. Parents and communities may not believe that inclusion is possible and desirable. Some 15% of parents in Germany and as many as 59% in Hong Kong fear that children with disabilities would disrupt others' learning. Many parents prefer the feeling of familiarity or exclusivity that some schools are offering. School choice often exacerbates a tendency to self-segregate. The report refers to several examples of segregation by income in Chile, between natives and migrants in Denmark, along sectarian lines in Lebanon, or by ethnicity in Malaysia. But there's also the other story. Parents of vulnerable children may have genuine fears that their children are not served well in mainstream schools. A study in Queensland, Australia, showed that 37% of students with intellectual disabilities in special schools had previously been in mainstream schools, but those schools did not have appropriate conditions that were sufficiently supportive. Parents and communities should be able to voice their concerns and be invited to the design of policies on inclusion in education. Partnership is a key word for government efforts to achieve inclusion. First, education ministries need to work with other ministries to share data on disadvantaged children to integrate the services they offer using common standards. In Colombia, registries identify those who are extremely poor, those who are internally displaced, and those who are indigenous to develop a living standards index that helps target social programs. However, worldwide, norms and bureaucratic cultures prevent coordination in the delivery of services, education and other social services. In Jordan, the two main government bodies who are responsible for people with disabilities had different ways of accrediting special schools, and that undermined efforts to inclusion. A new 10-year strategy is aiming to address precisely this issue. But we should also remember that education ministries need to ensure that when local governments are given a mandate to provide services for inclusion, that they are fully funded and that the capacities of the staff are fully developed. Because these days, inclusion is delivered at the local government level. NGOs, a range of NGOs, play two at least key roles in making the case for inclusion in societies. First, many NGOs are advocates and watchdogs for the right to inclusive education. They monitor progress on government commitments, often providing valuable information to national and international bodies. They defend against rights violations. They campaign for inclusive policies. In Armenia, an NGO campaign made the government commit to rolling out inclusive education fully in the country by 2025. Governments should create conditions for these NGOs to play this role. But secondly, these organizations also provide valuable education services, whether on government contract or on their own initiative. They support groups that governments do not reach, such as street children, or they provide non-formal and second chance education. The government of Afghanistan supports community-based education, which has been critical for reaching girls in rural areas. Governments should therefore ensure that NGO provision of education leads to inclusion, meets standards, and is aligned with national policy. The powerful concept of universal design refers to making products and services usable by all people. In education, it has been associated with the design of accessible school buildings, but also with flexible learning environments. But this idea of flexibility can be used much more widely. All students should learn from the same flexible, relevant, and accessible curricula. Yet many countries modify curricula to exclude or separate. Just think of special curricula for students with disabilities, or pushing lower achievers into slower education tracks, or those refugees who have been placed in parallel education systems. Textbooks can exclude by perpetuating stereotypes through omission or misrepresentation. The report has several examples. For example, in Punjab, Pakistan, only 24% of text and images in secondary school textbooks had women. These are not easy issues for any country. There are political challenges regarding the kind of society people aspire to achieve through education. And assessment, and that's a key aspect of social and emotional learning, should allow students to demonstrate learning in a variety of ways. It should not be a mechanism to force weak students to leave school early. Rather, it should be a tool to improve student learning. Around a quarter of teachers in middle and high-income countries reported a high need for professional development on teaching students with special needs. But teachers should not be taught inclusive approaches as a specialist topic. They should be taught this as part of the core education programs. In New Brunswick, Canada, a quarter of all teachers were trained to support students with autism. Teachers are not immune to social biases either. Their education needs to tackle entrenched views that some students are unable to learn. In the United States, 31% of teachers believe that inequality was mainly due to African Americans lacking willpower to pull themselves out of poverty. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, grade 8 mathematics teachers were more likely to give white students a passing grade than their equally proficient and well-behaved black classmates. Head teachers should communicate an inclusive school ethos. And the teaching body should reflect social diversity. In India, the share of scheduled castes in the teaching profession has increased, but remains below average. What data are collected and how determines very much whether inclusion is served. Identifying groups makes those disadvantaged visible, helping to prompt action. But doing so can also reduce children to labels, which can be self-fulfilling. Portugal has a non-categorical approach to determine special needs that is considered a model. Censuses and surveys help monitor outcomes at population level, although gaps remain. In 41% of countries, there has not been a publicly available household survey, which is a key to ensure that we have disaggregated data. But what is also important to remember is that formulating questions in these censuses and surveys on ethnicity, on religion, nationality, sexual orientation, or gender identity can touch on very sensitive personal information, can be intrusive, and can trigger persecution fears. Progress has been made. Kenya added new ethnic group categories, as well as intersex as a gender option in its latest census in 2019. Measurement of disability has caught up with the times through the Washington Group's questions and the child functioning module. But large discrepancies remain. Some countries do not capture even basic data, like Cameroon and Nigeria do not have enrollment data on children with visual impairments. But other countries monitor student experiences, go to the other ends. And I think it's appropriate for tonight that in the Karanga conference that New Zealand is a very good example of a country that monitors whether students feel cared for and if they maintain positive relationships. Just before ending, all these issues of inclusion are very complex. We cannot say in a very straight way whether some countries are better than others, because every society, as I mentioned, has its own challenges. So what is very important to stress is to say that countries need to learn from each other. How each country has traced and tracked and addressed its inclusion issues differs. So the report, as part of its launch last week, also launched a new website that compares how countries all around the world address issues of inclusion in their laws and policies. We call this new website PEER, which stands for Profiles Enhancing Education Reviews, that we hope to see being used, because we know that all of you who deal with comparative education are always interested in the question, how does country X or Y address these questions? We also invite you, given that I'm here, for those of you who may not be familiar, to also address and visit the websites that we have on education inequalities, which is a key source of information for the last 10 years, a website that has a database that is very interactive on how countries do in terms of education inequality on a number of education indicators and across different personal characteristics and their intersections. And Scoping Progress in Education, which is an interactive companion to the monitoring part of our report, where you can see some of the key issues in international education and the progress we're making towards the goals for 2030. So that brings me to an end. In a world increasingly faced with uncertainty and precariousness, inclusion has to be central to the future of education. So I'm going to invite you to ask now questions that are linking the theme of inclusion with the theme of social and emotional learning. Do use the hashtag for your communication. All means all, hopefully, answers to also your call. Thank you very much.
Manos, thank you so much for that and for sharing so much from the report. I wondered if I could start with a sort of general question before we look at SEL. And I wondered whether working on this year's report made you feel optimistic about the direction of travel globally around inclusive practices. Obviously, there's still an enormous amount of work to be done, but do you feel across the board that things are moving in a more inclusive direction?
In some ways, yes. I think one comparison matters very much. As you saw, we had a very comprehensive mapping of how every country in the world has legislated for inclusion, but also how countries have introduced policies for inclusion. And laws, we know, change much more slowly. And as you heard me saying, in 25% of countries, still countries officially segregate certain groups of students from others. In 48%, there is already still partial segregation. But when you look at policies, the shares of countries that really explicitly segregate is much, much lower. It's only 5%, which means that there is a movement, there is an understanding that countries need to include all students in their education system. Last year, we had the report on migration and displacement. And there we were able to show that of the 10 largest countries that are hosts of refugees, 8 were including the refugees in national education systems. Only 2 still had a reluctance to do that. So I think we can say safely that there is a general improved understanding but we still have a long way to go. And it's very difficult to compare countries. As I said, countries have very different histories and very different challenges. They may do well in some respects, but not in others.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think in some of the most significant SEL research work in recent years, there's been a kind of framing of how reforms need to be both top-down and bottom-up. So you need the policy environment to change, and that change to coincide or be caused by more grassroots mobilization. And it's also sometimes it's described as an inside-out, outside-in movement. And do you feel, is there more activism around inclusive education, and how does it link to issues of social justice?
Absolutely. I think you heard me dedicating quite a lot of space in a slide on the role of civil society and how they have been able to really mobilize through both their advocacy and watchdog functions to make society move. Now, we know, especially in the case of social and emotional learning, we had a policy paper last year that focused on the role of social and emotional learning programs in improving approaches, education approaches towards children that have suffered trauma from migration and displacement. And the, let's say, overwhelming evidence is that it is primarily non-governmental organizations and programs that have been trying to introduce and bring these ideas into the mainstream. It's a struggle. Education systems are quite slow in responding towards this need to be, let's say, more welcoming, and it's hard to find very good examples where such mainstreaming has happened. But there are examples. I think the report has shown how examples of NGO activity in early childhood has been quite influential in changing attitudes and teacher education programs to ensure that they build social and emotional skills, particularly through strengthening the relations, the interactions between teachers, students, and the communities, an element that was quite absent in many countries, but gradually it's being mainstreamed step by step. That's, I think, it's an important example. We see increasingly discussions of collaborative skills. The report demonstrates that disadvantaged students have fewer opportunities to practice collaborative skills, and yet this is shown to have very positive effects on overall learning. And we see in more examples of governments trying to introduce collaboration in their curriculum in high-income countries, still not very much in evidence in poorer countries. The big challenge is to continue the effort of making education more relevant. The examples, the report shows examples whereby a lot of poor countries are still stuck to certain patterns and certain curricula that are really a very exclusionary of poorer students, because they're not very relevant to their needs, and exposure to their natural environment, to the environment around them, the community, would really benefit them much more. But this is still at a very embryonic stage in the world's poorest countries.
I think I've just put a link to the policy paper that you referenced in the chat here, the one on education as healing. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yep,
which is, correct. I would strongly recommend to everyone to download. It's well worth reading, and has some really interesting case studies about the relationship between SEL and trauma and psychosocial support. I've got one final question I'd like to ask, if that's okay, before we bring in questions from the audience, and it's really around advocacy alignments, I think, because from a lot of what you said and a lot of the data that you shared, it feels like there could be much stronger alignments between SEL advocacy groups and people advocating for more inclusive practices. And I think one of the interesting things that the sort of impact of COVID-19 on education systems around the world is revealing is how these alliances are forming. So I'm thinking about Stefania Giannini the Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO, published an article a couple of weeks ago making the connection between education for sustainable development, social and emotional learning, and education's role in meeting the climate crisis. And so it's a really interesting alignment of slightly different agendas who find this kind of sweet spot or common alignment. And I wondered if you see things like that coming from the social and emotional learning community and the inclusive education community.
The international education agenda, we can actually think of it in broader terms. As it is today, after 2015, has brought together two very important strands of thought. The thought that was focusing specifically on poverty reduction, how to ensure that we escape the burden of poverty, and that has to a large extent quite an economic perspective of education. And that's also to some extent was the history of the report in many ways. But the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and its merging with the agenda from Rio and the environmental arm of sustainability has brought this second key aspect and pillar of education that we're trying increasingly to demonstrate, which is very much of how education is going to serve us in overcoming these major development challenges that are related to the common life on one planet. It is known, as you said, with the name of Education for Sustainable Development or Education for Global Citizenship. Yeah. And here, I would completely agree with you. There's a lot more to be done to put emphasis, the right emphasis, on all these strands, very disparate strands that are not working together to achieve sufficient focus. Because at the international level, when we talk about development, the focus is primarily on the poverty reduction, as I said, more the idea of investment in education for poverty reduction. But there has been, by comparison, extremely little effort to do the research that shows how we can fix the broken link between education that in theory, subject-based education that in theory emphasizes the environment or civic skills, and yet we see that it may change the attitudes, but it has not yet shown any concrete links of changing behaviors. And it's a broken link that is really tragic in many ways, and it requires all sorts of collaboration between all those who are invested in the effort of increasing empathy in education, of making the whole school approach that would build the relationships, would build the self-awareness, the self-management, those aspects that social and emotional learning is really focusing on. So I would very much encourage that establishing these bridges with people who argue for work on sustainable development, who work on global citizenship, who work on inclusion. Social and emotional learning can be very much the link between these to turn them into a stronger advocacy element.
I think there are 9 references to social and emotional learning in the 2020 report, and it either seems to come up in the context of work around how SEL work can help develop sense of identity or sense of belonging, or it comes up in a sort of negative framing where there isn't enough research done or there aren't enough policies in place to have the data that you need. But I think the relationship between SEL interventions and helping students develop their own sense of identity and sense of belonging, and then around developing empathy as well, feels like a crucial point of alignment with some of the inclusive education agenda. There's a couple of really interesting questions have come through. Some of them not SEL specific, but we'll take a couple of those if that's okay. So in terms of inputs, what do you feel the biggest barrier is to inclusive education globally? Do you think is it attitude? Is it teacher capacity? Is it parental concerns?
I think I mentioned all of those. I think the report tries to build the comprehensive view of inclusion. It's not about one or the other. Those of you who might go to consult it will see that we have chapters that are dedicated to these different issues, so laws and policies, governance and finance, data, curricular, textbooks and assessments, teachers, schools as communities, and communities outside the school, the role of parents in particular. All of those matter. We have 10 recommendations in the report, and there has been a poll for people to decide. I think inevitably the tendency is to think of the role of teachers. Teachers, as I mentioned, generally speaking, they follow the general population. They tend to have more positive attitudes towards inclusion, but they can also be a spanner in the works, not allowing this broader conception of inclusion to be embracing diversity, because they suffer from the biases of society. I would say we need to make sure that we attract into the profession those people who are most ready and most prepared. Of course, we know that the majority are motivated by the desire to offer to society. They see it as a function that is of higher level, but we still need to work hard to make sure that all of our teachers are very much committed to the idea that every student has potential and every student can learn, that their potential is not fixed. That's, I think, the heart of the matter, if you ask me. And I think that's the general perception also among our audiences when we share the poll with them.
A final closing question, if that's okay, is, could you see social and emotional learning or education for sustainable development, or any of its other names, be the focus of a future global education monitoring report on the way to 2030?
Definitely. I mean, I can say that in the last decision round we made, we have an advisory board, an international advisory board that is truly global, that has no other decision but one, to select the theme of the global education monitoring board, or one of the future themes. This, in fact, we have tomorrow our board, but there won't be any selection because we already have the themes for 2021. Which is the role of non-state actors in education, and 22-23, which will be technology. When we decide on technology, there was also the option of social and emotional learning. Was one of 5 topics that were proposed. It didn't do very well. I think the report has been generally associated with the quantitative approach, the fact that we need to report on progress in education, we need to report on evidence and examples that work. And it's true that it's a very there's a data, let's say, source of evidence that is growing, but it's still not strong enough at a global level to support sufficiently a global education monitoring report. I think our advisory board is probably concerned. I imagine it has not been expressed as openly in that way, because, as I say, from our perspective, we think it's valuable. We propose because it's us coming forward with potential themes and potential arguments in favor or against, or in favor of any topic being selected. But I think the selection, the mechanism we see, the reactions and the responses during the board meeting seem to favor topics that can be supported at least with some quantitative evidence. Now, this year, we showed that it is possible to come up with quantitative evidence also through qualitative means, by launching our peer website. And maybe our board could be looking at this topic in the future in a different way. We are thinking of enriching the peer website with other layers of themes. So we will be focusing, for example, on quantitative, on evidence on financing that supports equity. We'll have the private sector regulation as a theme. We'll have gender equality, but we will be also considering adding a layer on climate change education, and that may be spurring also our board into action and considering that such a theme could also be considered before 2030.
I feel within everything you just said, there's a really interesting call to action for the SEL community to do more advocacy and make the case in new ways, because a global education monitoring report that focused on SEL would be an amazing resource. And I think something that everyone involved with this conference would be very interested in helping you with and contributing to. Manos, we're at time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for sharing the insights from the report and being part of the Q&A and joining the Karanga conference. And good luck with the ongoing rollout of national events around the report. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much for inviting
now
me.
going to hand over to Jojo for who's going to lead us through the next panel.
Great, thank you so much, Dominic. What a fantastic keynote, and I think really leads us perfectly into this topic of SEL and social justice. I really want to just refer to a quote that a friend of mine, Dina Simmons, talks about a lot. It's really about how can we move or make sure that we move from social and emotional learning to social and emotional equity. So I think that's a really good theme to start this panel. We have three amazing women who are joining us this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening. We have Erin Jones, who's an education and systems consultant based in the US, but she was raised in the Netherlands. We have Taylor-Jorgensen from New Zealand, Aotearoa, and we have Maria Raad, who is raised in Ecuador and is living in Chile. So we've got lots of different voices from all over the world. So it's my pleasure to first of all introduce you to Tara, who's going to start first of all. Tara is has been a teacher, she's been a principal, she's also a mum of three. She recognised that New Zealand has a great education system, but she also knows that there are certain things that needs to be worked on as well, just as Manos was talking about. She's looking really hard to remove some systemic barriers. She's working closely with the ministry and minister to really look at how can we make social justice a real theme in New Zealand. So we welcome you with open arms. Tara, over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, no oti puti o kora hau I tumu aku, ko Tara Taylor-Jorgensen tuku ingoa. Good morning or morena, everybody. I'm speaking to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand at, it's just gone 7 o'clock now in the morning, so it's actually not too awful. I'd normally be jumping on a train. I'm from Dunedin, which is at the bottom of New Zealand, but I'm speaking to you at the moment from the Kapiti Coast, which I've got behind me on my Zoom background. It's a beautiful place. I'm a principal advisor at the Ministry of Education and for Pauline Cleaver, who would have been here today, but unfortunately she's on taking some well-deserved leave. So we'll let her away with that. She's been working very hard over the lockdown period. And as Jo just said, prior to working at the ministry, I was a teacher and then a school principal. So here's a beautiful picture of New Zealand. It's always good looking at things from above, especially like in the Zoom. I always try to get my camera looking at me from above. And as I said, it's winter here, and this is the time of year where these matariki stars appear, which signify the beginning, new beginnings and a new year. Other names for this cluster would be Pleiades or Subaru, but at this time of year, it's very significant for us. We are a bicultural nation. We've got 3 official languages, which are Te Reo, Māori, New Zealand Sign Language, and English. We're also treaty partners, and I'd love to talk to you more about that today, but it's a very, very complex topic, and we are limited on time, but basically means that there are 3 principles of partnership, participation, and protection, which underpin the relationship that we have between the government and Māori. So working for the government, it's really important that I acknowledge that, and actually being a New Zealand citizen, it's also important that I acknowledge that too. I want to start talking about our beautiful young people that we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have a fantastic, flexible curriculum, which is not prescriptive, and people are able to develop local curriculum in their areas which reflect the intention of the national curriculum. And you can see here one of our intentions of the national curriculum really coming through in that we encourage kids to take action and think about things from other perspectives. And here we can see them fighting for social justice. This was a protest in relation to colonisation and land confiscation, which we're still seeing its effects in Aotearoa today. Similarly, we've got a very active youth, rainbow youth community, where we can see our kids taking action and fighting for the rights of the rainbow community. And we also had this amazing climate change protest in March last year, and it was incredible because it was actually organised by the children, and it was quite hilarious looking out my window at the Ministry of Education, seeing these children coming together, fighting for climate change without any adults around. So there were no neat lines crossing the roads, and it was more like this blob just moving together, and it was amazing, and it really should have made the papers that night. Normally, with a huge movement like this, it would have plastered our screens. Unfortunately, instead, this is the same day that this iconic picture of our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern came to be because of a horrendous mass murder that took place in a Christchurch mosque. So, although we are often touted as almost like a utopic place to be, we can do better. So our Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern has been looking, she's very passionate about children, and she and her people went and asked the nation basically about what could make New Zealand a better place to be. And she was astounded by the number of children who said that they do experience discrimination and racism in our schools. So I'm going to talk now really about what we are trying to do to address this. So the Child, Youth and Wellbeing Strategy is one of the things that we're doing, and the essence of the vision for this is that we plant the seed of love in our children and they will blossom, grow and journey towards the greatest pathway of life. This framework will help drive and align policy efforts and investments inside and outside of government. So I think that's quite a lovely vision, and you can really see the empathy coming through our government values, which is great to see from my point of view. One of the other big headlines last year that hit our media was to update our national curriculum to ensure that learning Aotearoa New Zealand histories was an explicit expectation for all our learners. Now, at the beginning of this, I spoke about how our curriculum is very flexible and not prescriptive, but we are discovering that there are certain things that can't be left to chance, like knowing the treaty rights, Māori histories, and it will have a positive impact on our learners if everybody can see themselves in our histories. Prior to that, it was very Eurocentric. In response to the Christchurch mosque incident, we developed a challenging racism kit that goes into New Zealand classrooms. But it's in order to take up this kit, you need to be prepared to focus on assessing where you are as an adult in terms of understanding diversity and making commitment to advancing that. We acknowledge that different adults are at different parts of their journey with that. So really, it's really important that they don't compare their starting points with other teachers in other classrooms, and that they just commit to make progress in this area. A piece of work that I'm working on at the moment is about social and emotional learning and valuing that in the New Zealand curriculum as well as we are with New Zealand histories. We know that the root cause of why we need social and emotional learning is because we need to challenge systemic inequities for people. And we know that learning about it is going to help access equitable learning opportunities, which we heard about with our previous speaker. But we also know that social and emotional learning is really complex, and we also know that context is really important. So in the New Zealand curriculum, we have managing self and relating to others, but I can manage myself in one context very well. I think I'm managing myself well in this one, but in another context, I won't. And so by measuring that and kind of judging children on where they are at these things, can be quite dangerous and could actually end up being a bit of an assimilation tool if in the wrong hands. So we went through the nation and talked to a bunch of different people, and we came up with these 10 elements, which I think I've heard being referred to in the previous talks, that it's not just about having good manners and being well behaved, but actually looking more deeply at these kinds of things. The jury's out on self-control. That's why there's a question mark there. We get a lot of pushback on that because that is quite a Western construct. So we're looking at things more like learner agency rather than self-control. It's just got a different connotation, and there's something in self-control that we're getting a bit of pushback on. Like our previous speaker just said, we want to support learners. We need to assume that learners are inherently capable, that they have unlimited potential, and that they're individuals in their own right. So doing a lot of work on here, and we're not quite at the answer there yet. And then the last point I want to make is around lifting sector capability. We put an emphasis on kids developing their social and emotional learning, but we also need our workforce to do the same thing. And one of our we've changed our professional learning priorities, one of which is around cultural capability, where teachers need to grow their critical consciousness, challenge discrimination and racism and bias in the education system, because like our previous speaker said, we are finding that we do have that bias in our workforce. And I think that's my 7 minutes.
It's well your 7 minutes. You're amazing. Thank you so much. That was really, really, really interesting. And I think one of the things that is always fascinating about New Zealand, and I try not to be biased because I'm from there, is that people are very self-reflective. And I think what you're showing is a real representation of that, and really looking hard at what we're doing and what we're not getting right, and really trying to fix it at a systemic level. So hopefully there were some questions that you can answer towards the end of that. Thank you so much, Tara, for that. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Erin Jones. Erin Jones' class, I hope, is still online listening to her. Erin is a little bit late coming on. I did give her the wrong time because I'm challenged when it comes to times when they're on international time. And the class is probably going to be very upset with me, but we welcome you, Erin. Erin is living here in the United States. She ran for the State Superintendent of Education for Washington State at the last election. She missed out by 1%. She was the first Black woman to ever run for that. So we're really proud of her for that. And she uses her voice to inspire students, adults, and teachers to really, really think about what's really important for them. And she looks to make sure that there are equitable practices across for everybody. So we welcome you, Erin. Join us for your session. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to put something up on my screen here. Just want to start with some really simple slides around equity to kind of situate how I think about social emotional learning. And I think about it through the lens of equity. And although I am an academic, this is my 30th year working in and around schools. I've been a classroom teacher, a state administrator, and a building or a district administrator. I've done kind of the gamut from elementary, middle school, high school teaching, almost every subject area, and almost every level in the system. I've really devoted the last 4 years of my life to really thinking about what does equity mean. And I want to give you just a simple image that for me has worked really well. I think the mistake we make when we talk about equity, and I'm pretty explicit about talking about racial equity, is we tend to focus first on the system, trying to write policy and change policies. But if you have not done your own self-work, and I love that I came after Tara because I think she got to this, we have to start with self. What is the personal story that I bring into this work? Because the personal story I have gives me a lens for now the students that I engage. So starting with personal story, then moving to who's the community I'm serving, then to the systems. We often get that backwards, and we want to start with systems. So self, you all bring a story. My personal story, I was born in the United States to a white woman and a Black man, forced to be given away at birth because my white mother in 1971 was not allowed to keep a Black child, adopted by a white couple who decided to teach in the Netherlands. So I have lived in the United States. I've lived in the Netherlands. My father taught in Switzerland every summer. So I speak 4 languages. I am both white and Black. I have lived in a predominantly white country. And then I came back to the United States for university and came face to face with racism and both the covert and overt racism that is still existent here in the United States that you see on the news every day now. But I will say I've been here now for 30 years and it is on the news now, but it's no different than it was when I first got here. And so we've got to do our own personal work. Every single one of us has a story of identity and has a story of race. And I think a lot of people in the United States think that only Black and brown and Native people, Indigenous people have stories of race, but white people also have stories of race. And until you're willing to unpack those stories and understand what are all the stories that I bring to the table, what are my expertises, what are the ways that I was told my skin color mattered, either for positive and negative, until we've unpacked those stories, it's almost impossible for us to really understand the people we're serving. So part 2 is now, who's the community I'm serving? Who's in my community? And in particular, who are those members of my community that I don't know well? Who are the voices that are not at the table? Who are we not listening to? Whose narratives are not showing up in positive ways in our literature, in our history textbooks? And so first you have to do your own self-work. What's my own story? What are the glasses that I wear? We all wear lenses, all of us do. How do I unpack those? And then secondly, now, how do I now understand the community that I'm serving and all the different types of groups of people that I'm serving? And we all have some expertise and we all have gaps. And then lastly, what are the systems? And in particular, when talking about young people, what are the practices that are happening within the school space? So who has access to services around special education? Who in our country, who is automatically put into English language learning classes? Who is it, for whom is it assumed they don't speak English in the quote unquote right ways? Who has access to advanced programs? Who is on track to go to university? Who's not? All of those things are systems, but also what are the systems at play outside of the school space that affect how our students show up in the school space? So who has access to housing and healthcare and food and all of those myriad things? And so I just wanted to share a simple diagram just to kick it off, because that's the lens through which I think about social emotional learning now. When we think about our own personal story as an educator, if I haven't done my own personal work, then here's what can happen. Social emotional programs can now become a weapon that is used to assimilate children who are not like you, right? And so what happens in the United States, and I had the opportunity, the gift of teaching in Philadelphia, then in South Bend, Indiana, then Columbus, Ohio, Corvallis, Oregon, and then the area around Seattle. I've taught in almost every region of the United States. We often weaponize social emotional learning programs to make sure that especially Black and brown and Indigenous students are kind of forced into, this is what good behavior looks like. And so we've got to be really careful as we think about social emotional learning. What is the narrative that I bring to the table? What is my narrative about what it means to be a good person? Is it really about good behavior? And is that good behavior driven by cultural norms, right? Or is this about how to be kind to each other, right? And have we interrogated all of those things? I don't think we have in a lot of ways. And so these programs that are meant to do really great things can often be used as weapons. So just to be conscientious and cautious about that, we've got to first, so one is let's not weaponize the curriculum. Number two, which I love that Tara said, and I screenshotted all of her slides because I'm about to send those to our ministry. We are not anywhere close to New Zealand in the sense of thinking about the racial implications of all. We're not there in this country at all. One of my messages often is we can't fix what we're not willing to face. And as a nation, we have not been willing to face the ways that racism has played a role in how students get to experience school. But we cannot put the onus on our students to fix something that must be addressed by adults first. And so as we're thinking about social emotional learning, we have got to be thinking about adult behaviors first. How are we preparing adults to carry out this stuff? If we haven't done the adult work first, then again, we will likely weaponize curriculum that's meant to do really good work. And so we've got to be really careful to make sure adults get what they want or what they need. Then lastly, really important, as we're coming out of COVID, as we're coming out of being away from school, we have to be really thinking about, as much as people are worried about academic learning loss, I'm actually more concerned about the trauma that students and staff have experienced over this time. So in this country, we have been inundated. Black and brown bodies are dying at high rates of COVID, but also look at what's happening in the news. That has caused trauma, and not just to students. It has also caused trauma to our teachers. And so we've got to address, as we think about social emotional learning, we've got to support our teachers, and in particular our Black, brown, and Native teachers and students, and making sure SEL is addressing those needs as well.
Thank you so much, Erin. You've given us a very large lot of things to think about. And I think one of the things that really strikes me is about the adults. I think we've always focused in education so much on the children, but actually what you're really pushing for us to really consider is, what are the adults' attitudes like? What are they thinking? What are they believing? And what do they understand about themselves? Something that I've certainly experienced in working in space as well. Thank you so much. Please stay on for a bit. We've got some questions coming for you after this. And I'd like to welcome Maria Raad. Maria is from, she's living in Chile, but she's originally from Ecuador. She's the director of Ecosystem, and it's an initiative developed by the David Rockefeller Center of Harvard in Chile to promote radical collaboration and collective impact in STEAM education and promotion of the 21st century skills. So we're really excited to have her on board today. She's also a WISE winner from the Qatar Foundation, and she's done a lot of exciting things, and I'll let her share that with you. Thank you very much, Anna. Come on board and join us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. Let me see. I think this is the one. Can you see it? Okay, perfect. I just would like to start with three main ideas about how do I see the connection between social emotional learning and justice. The first idea, and maybe the one that really moved me, is the idea about that this crisis has an equal impact for those living in poverty. We know that school closures and social isolation has affected all the students, but also particularly for those living in poverty and very vulnerable situations. We know that children and young people, as we were listening during the first period of this conference, is that they cannot learn when basic needs are not met. And today, access to internet seems to be a very basic need, but also very important is the companion and the kind of relationship that can support them in true, safe, and nurture learning environment. And that kind of relationship is provided by adults like teachers, mentors, and so on. So we're facing lower learning gains due to this COVID-19 situation. And for example, just to give you an idea about what is happening in Latin America, in countries like Mexico, like Colombia, like Peru, we only have one in two students in rural areas have access to internet at home. So we are really struggling with this situation all around the continent. Also, and I think it's important to understand the situation in countries around Latin America, dropout rates are starting to increase. And that is because children and young people are feeling disconnected to the learning process, and also because due to their situation, probably they will have to work at home for domestic works, and also because their parents cannot pay for the school. So there is, for example, a great program that I wanted to share with you that was evaluated by Harvard University last month, and it's named Sumate. Sumate is an organization that works with young people who are in vulnerable situations, and they are working with them to strengthen their emotional connections throughout tutors and teachers. And the important thing about that program is that they are providing the connection with the teachers and with the tutors, even if they cannot meet personally. So they are using very different strategies like chatting by WhatsApp, using mail to reach their parents, connecting with their social emotional aspects, and they are trying to maintain them into the system, the school system, in order to assure that they can really end this process without dropping out. But the main function of this strategy is to support them emotionally. So when we are facing this poor population with more vulnerable situation, we have to realize that we cannot make the same or to apply the same strategies. And that is the second idea that I would like to share, is that, the school has a unique equalizer function. Even if we have schools down, closed, we need to address this huge challenge by providing the support that teachers need and principals need in order to reach this population. So when teachers and principals were asked around Latin America about which were their main priorities, number one and second are still academic results, but in the third answer was to ensure well-being of teachers. The fourth one was to support students who lack skills for independent study, and the fifth one is to ensure well-being of students. So when we think about how a school system can be a real equalizer, we have to think, for example, in new instruction, locally contextualized and very flexible ones. We cannot keep the same school structure, and we cannot keep the same educational process when we are in a moment of such a crisis. And how does a new instruction and locally contextualized and flexible education looks like in order to bring and to keep these students, young people in the system? The first is to provide all the support and the pedagogical process based on their choices, connecting them with their curriculum and their interests, and providing them multiple opportunities to demonstrate learning. For example, as we know, project-based learning is something that we have been using around Latin America with great results in terms of social emotional learning. Recognizing the voice of the young people is also very important. And as I was saying, contextualizing the curriculum into their everyday life. As I was saying, new instruction, locally contextualized and flexible to local circumstances are very critical. And we cannot separate, and this is another idea that I want to share, we cannot separate the process of learning and instruction from the need to develop skills such as self-regulation, empathy, understanding emotion. I think it has been a very difficult situation to keep these kind of worlds separated, and today we are facing the importance of embrace them together, and we have to work on that. And the other idea that I wanted to share is the importance of bringing families and parents in vulnerable situations also as part of the strategy. They also need this kind of support. And I wanted to share one of the programs that we launched or developed during this crisis. It is managed by Ecosystem, the program that I lead, but it's basically a program shared with 60 more organizations in 7 countries, all together working to support parents and teachers in the process of bringing these learning needs with social emotional learning needs. And today we are, for example, providing information about empathy, how to develop better relationships, stress management, self-regulation, transforming difficulties into positive action. We have many organizations that are also today participating in this webinar, like Atentamente. We are also having a WISE organization providing some support about it. And one of the main challenges has to do with the question about how to deliver this support to parents who have more restriction. And to address this challenge, we have been diversifying the platforms from internet to radio, public TV, and offline solutions. In this process of delivery, we can either integrate or exclude the population if we don't have in mind the basic resources and the basic needs that they have. So one of the ideas of Aprendo en Casa was always to answer, okay, how can we deliver information through social emotional development, but also how can we assure that this information is really getting into the most needed population. And finally, the last idea that I wanted to share with you that I think is very important is how these ecosystems can increase social justice and collective success. This is not a one-person success, not a one organization success, basically because we need to think in terms of a system. That means to coordinate, to work between different levels and stakeholders. For example, youth programs, as I mentioned, Súmate, a school day classroom, all the things that we have been saying about new pedagogies and instruction, families like Aprendo en Casa, where the quality of adult and youth interaction and learning are a priority. And these efforts, in my opinion, requires more, also a very specific skill, which are to be more empathic or to have empathy and collaboration. We are working on that because we are 60 organizations that usually we work in different areas with different perspectives. And today we are facing that challenge to not only share these skills, social, emotional, and learning skills that we want to share with our beneficiaries, but also we want to make a difference in the way we can address these huge challenges. So as I was saying, one of the most important learned or ideas that we have been always working on has been how can we provide a solution without keeping the exclusion growing and growing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. That was wonderful. And we've heard three very different situations that have been talking about SEL and social justice. But it's really interesting to hear that there are some really definite themes coming out. We've had a couple of really interesting questions. The first one is from one of the panelists saying, how can we ensure that social and emotional learning is not used as a tool for behavior management or behavior control? Would one of our panelists like to answer that? How can we ensure that it's not used in this way? Erin.
I would recommend, again, going back to my slides, we have to do our own personal work first. Because really the reasons it gets weaponized is because we haven't done our own work and we end up just projecting our own norms, which often are Eurocentric. And how do I know that? Because I was raised by white folks in Europe. Like I know Eurocentric norms really well. I'm married to a Black man. He's very loud and uses his, just culturally, he's very different. Often his behavior was managed as a student because he didn't show up with the same norms. How do I recognize that? Because when we got married, we had to deal with that stuff. And it was such an aha for me when I got into the classroom. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to make students become like I was raised. And I had to really interrogate that's where the interrogation of my own story came. Is when I got married and was in the classroom working with all Black students and said, oh my gosh, that's why students are showing up in this way. The way they show engagement is not by raising a hand and waiting to be called on. It's like the Black church, it's call and response. A teacher says something great, the kid shouts out. That's not bad. It's just a different way of engaging. And so it's all about, you've got to do your own personal stuff first. That's the only way we can guarantee that it's not weaponized.
Thank you so much. And often so many people, as you said in your talk, Erin, spend time thinking about systems first, but actually it's personal first. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Tara, did you want to add something, or Anna?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Erin, but we did find that when we talked to teachers across the country that the interpretation of social and emotional learning was one around whether or not the children were well behaved. Yeah. And so that's the thing that we're really trying to change, which is why we've changed the elements to be a bit less behaviory, if that's a word.
Can I ask a bit more about that, Tara? Because I think that was a second question, and I'll come back to you, Anna, to ask you to respond to that first one. Is that, you know, the definition of SEL seems to be a really big issue, because if people are considering that's behaviour, how have you addressed that? So you asked people, and you've identified that that's actually not what you're thinking SEL is.
Yeah, that's right. We did the kind of traditional research first, and just found that there was nothing really relevant in a New Zealand context. And then even with New Zealand research, there was often stuff that wasn't relevant in a local context. So we, a bit similar to what's happened today, we've gone and asked a whole lot of people what they think, and everybody thinks something different, but there are emerging themes. And yeah, context, I just cannot say enough, context really, really matters.
Context, localization, getting a really clear definition, understanding what the language means. All of those.
And also weaving it into your classroom program, as opposed to making it today we're going to learn about social emotional learning, but it's a way of being, it's a lifestyle, but like a diet versus a lifestyle change.
Okay, thanks, Tara. Anna, did you want to add something?
Yes, probably the idea about the importance of redefining learning. I mean, when we talk about social and emotional learning, we are thinking always, okay, how can we keep kids well behaved in order to learn academically? And it's more than that. We have to learn the whole world, the relationships, and that is something that is obvious, but it's not.
So it sounds like we're going right back to a redefinition of what's important about learning and the purpose of learning. That sounds exciting to me. Okay. I just would like to, we're getting close to finishing. Is there any other questions that anybody from the audience has? If you'd like to pop them into the question section now, but is there any final comments that any of you three would like to make? Just any final sort of summation that you want to share as a point after you've listened to each one of you speak as well, because you'd have probably sparked something for each of you too. Erin.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, in the end, you know, the greatest gift of the pandemic has been having my own classroom for the last 82 days. So today was my 82nd day with my students. And I think what I've relearned is that really the power of learning is when we allow students to be their best selves. That's the whole point, is how do we allow students to be their best selves, and how do we allow them to be curious? I know someone in the chat had said, you know, how do we create places where students can have difficult conversations and not agree with one another? Yes, that's what I want. I want to create spaces where we are courageous and brave enough to have conflict, but to know how to do it without devaluing someone. And so I want to end with sharing something that one of the people in my adult class says all the time: humility, humanize, and historicize. If we could all show up with humility, even as the adults in a classroom, right? I love that my students say, we love Ms. Erin because she allows us to be equals in her classroom. So humility as the adults. If we could put human value at the center, every one of the young people who comes into our space has incredible value. And then if we could historicize, if we could face the systems, whether the school system or our history, if we could really honestly face it and look at the history and be honest and say, you know what, we can do better. That has incredible power.
Thank you, Erin. Awesome. Thank you. Anna.
Just to mention how important it is to recognize the voice of the students, I mean, children and young people, inside the classroom. That is something, again, very obvious, but it's not as usual as we would like to be. And when we talk about new pedagogies, we should not confuse or make the mistake of having effective and very didactic methodologies inside the classroom to have the same outputs. We need to change also the kind of outputs that we want to have from the learning process. And that, as Erin was saying, to deal with conflict, to embrace conversations, not only to use, for example, PBL, project-based learning, to integrate areas, but to discover new ways of understanding us. And that is something, I'm coming from the school system and I'm working always with teachers and principals. And when you bring new ideas, new methodologies, without trying to change the reason why you are using that, you are not really changing anything.
That's right. That's a beautiful way of summing up. Thank you so much, Anna. Tara, final words.
Final words would be, can't underestimate the impact of relationships, really getting to know students and their families, their whānau, their aspirations, their goals, and what they bring with them to the classroom from a strengths-based point of view. If you know your kids, you're going to have a much better time, and school's going to be a much better place.
Thank you so much to all three panelists. I think one of the things that strikes me about social and emotional learning and social justice is that it's really about humans having the best time they can in this earth. I always talk about education as giving children an opportunity to learn about who they are, how they fit into the world, and then how they can each contribute their unique gift to humanity. And if we can provide that for every child, then we're in a really good space. So with heartfelt thanks to all three of you wonderful people, we really appreciate you all, and thank you for your wisdom, your knowledge, and your sharing of your heart and your souls with us this morning. And I pass it back to you, Matt, to take us through to the break. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, thank you very much. That was, I appreciate it. I'm excited to bring us into the next part of the session. Just a second, let me pull it up here. So, and before we go into the next part of the session, I wanted to take a moment to remind everyone that after this is over, at 6 p.m. Eastern time, we'll have another session starting over in a different area of Zoom. The Knowledge Hook social emotional learning series can be having another panel. I see the information right up here on the screen. So if you'd like to, you're welcome to register for it right now, and the link's down there in the corner. And we'd love to see you over where we're finished up here in a couple of hours. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next section. We're going to take a little break from the live session and to a part that I really enjoy. Something that we did is that we, in the social emotional learning and education community, we put out a call to our members around the world, asking for them to share social emotional learning strategies that they think are particularly powerful for supporting social justice, for supporting students that are dealing with trauma. And we gathered some of those. And we're gonna play some of them here for you right now. These are quick, short snippets of from a lot of great educators, and I think you're gonna really appreciate seeing this diversity of ideas that are gonna come out here. So I'm going for you. Oops.
Thank you for the invitation to share with you.
Let me fix the sound there for you guys.
Thank you for the invitation to share with you what we have done, which is part of the program for knowledge of the Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian. Since February, the Academy has been promoting self-regulated learning in the classroom called the Rainbow Project, involving about 100 students 9 to 10 years old. The project is based in a narrative, Sarilhos do Amarelo, which can be translated as Yellow's Troubles. and is about the 7 colors of the rainbow, their different personalities, and how they deal with different situations throughout their adventure of looking for the disappeared yellow. When the project was suspended because of the lockdown, the team decided to adapt the approach. Every week, we sent by email and regular mail a kind of learning guide setting goals for the following week. Students could hear the chapters of that week being read at the local radio, Radio Clube de Monsanto. From that reading, they were challenged to answer to questions and do an activity that would help to achieve the goals. So during those weeks, we work with them, knowledge and skills related to planning, monitoring, evaluating, problem solving, knowing and understanding their own feelings, and the role of engagement and effort for learning achievements. In the project's blog, they could find each week the learning guide, the recording, and challenges. The Yellow Travels at Distance was implemented for 6 weeks and was the way we found to maintain the social and emotional learning alive. We believe that in a time like this, that children are for the first time learning by themselves. Self-regulated skills play a key role. More than ever, there is a need to promote them among children, youngsters, and adults. Thank you so much, obrigada, for being interested in learning more about our marvelous experience. It was a pleasure to share it with you.
Hi, I'm Lynn Thomas. I'm a secondary school English teacher from Ontario, Canada. One way that I use social-emotional learning to support social justice is through my mental health unit that I do with my senior English classes. Basically, it allows students to take on the perspective of other people, and this helps to increase their capacity to understand others, as well as themselves, and increase their empathy. Basically, there are a few ways that this happens during the course of the unit. Students read memoirs. We connect with experts and other people who share their personal stories so that students get a variety of perspectives from various people to broaden their view and help them to understand how other people see the world. This coincides with some explicit instruction about neuroscience and how our brain works, and a lot of metacognition and reflection. So basically, the students increase their self-awareness, but they also increase their awareness of those around them and in the larger world and community. In the end, students improve not only their own mental wellness and understanding, but it goes a long way to help reduce stigma and increase empathy. That then translates to further situations, not only restricted to mental wellness aspects. Thanks for listening. That's how I incorporate various social emotional learning strategies to help increase social justice and empathy.
Hi, folks. Imagine for a moment that in the midst of all this turmoil and divisiveness and hate and racism and injustice, that everyone in the world became 4 years old again. Citizens, police officers, homeless, business professionals, restaurant servers, people of all ages and races and income levels all became 4 years old again. If that were the case, would we hate and hurt each other? Or would we be friendly and kind? Would we stay stuck in our beliefs? Or would we use our wild imagination and creativity to consider what else might be possible? Would we be tense and on edge? Or would we be fun and silly? Would we judge and exclude each other? Or would we be genuinely curious about each other's lives? My name is Micah Skandar, and I'm the founder of Time Travel Journeys, a breakthrough social emotional learning program that helps middle schoolers gain greater self-compassion and self-confidence by connecting them to the best qualities of their past and the most anticipated experiences of their future. A unique combination of self-reflection and future visioning. Through photos, memories, stories, journal entries, and hands-on activities, I guide middle schoolers through each phase of their life, connecting them to the curiosity, imagination, compassion, playfulness, and other virtues that come so naturally to us in our early childhood. One day, kids are looking at baby photos of themselves and interviewing their parents about who they were. The next day, they're reconnecting to preschool, interviewing an actual 4-year-old and playing with Play-Doh, reconnecting to all those feelings and all those qualities of what it was like. At a time when kids start to disconnect in middle school from those pure childlike qualities and become more judgmental of themselves and others, this process, this journey, reminds them of who they were and who they can become. It changes their self-perception in ways that carry far into adulthood. This is a pillar of my SEL approach and what I believe to be the key to a more loving, tolerant, peaceful coexistence among people in this world, digging through layers of who we were and who we can become in order to discover the best of ourselves. So while we may not literally be able to go back to age 4, we all have the ability to remember and to tap into the kind, curious, compassionate, and creative 4-year-old inside of all of us. And when we do that, the possibilities for positivity and progress are endless. Thank you for your time. I look forward to sharing more.
Semear Valores on Air Academy is one of the many Gulbenkian knowledge academies operating in Portugal. The meaning of its name is Sowing Values on Air. This academy takes place along 3 school years between 2019 and 2022 at the Ibn Mukana School in Cascais. This academy was created through the partnership of 4 institutions, a Vida Ama, Semear Valores, Dan Comunicação, and the school itself, and also 2 funders, Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation and the Cascais City Council. Semear Valores on Air aims to promote communication, adaptability, resilience, and creative thinking in 360 students from 7th to 12th grades. These goals will be achieved through the creation of a school online radio made by young people. This radio promotes reflection, involvement, and meaningful learning on topics relevant to students' well-being and citizenship. At the same time, students become a positive influence for the entire community of listeners. Students learn social-emotional themes while at the same time develop and record radio contents in teams. We were actively doing this since the beginning of the school year. Students had chosen the radio name, we had planned the radio launch event to happen in March, and had just started to send invitations when Portugal went on confinement on March 16th. After 2 weeks, the Easter holiday came, and that gave us a time and opportunity to redesign our plan along with our partners. During that time, the school decided to keep with online classes, which allowed us to keep in touch with the students. As soon as we figured out a way to keep the program's recordings, we've decided to go on with the academy. Students have continued to develop their scripts at home and send us to revision. Recordings were not held at the school studio, but via Zoom. And finally, the radio launch was made online on May 22nd. We have decided to keep the academy for 3 main reasons. First, the nature of the program allowed a satisfactory solution to keep it going. Second, students had the expectation to listen what they have created along the year. And third, because if there was a better time to put in practice resilience, was this. Every day, you can listen to 3 different programs at 8 a.m., 3 p.m., and 9 p.m., all done by students. Enjoy!
Hi, I'm Babu Matthew, Senior Researcher at the Center for Advanced Research in Socio-Emotional Learning, based out of Cochin in the state of Kerala in India. Our organization has been involved in the educational transformation of a few indigenous communities in 2 districts of the state of Kerala for the past few years. These communities speak a language without a script, and more than 90% of the elders have not attended school. Decades of deprivation, social isolation, and educational backwardness have made them vulnerable, and the community members often fails to cope with the challenges of the 21st century. Under such grave circumstances, it becomes imperative that we build a sense of self-belief, collaboration, resilience, and a powerful urge to dream be instilled in the minds of the children. The idea was to use education as a tool and SEL as a platform to bring about social justice to the indigenous communities. We chose 100 grade 5 children every year, and these children were provided a 750-hour weekend knowledge interactions over a 10-month period. An initial screening revealed the fact that almost all the learners had grade 1 skills in both language and numeracy. We visited their families to understand their living environment, had empathic telephonic conversations with them every week, and had informal family gatherings every month. The children were received on their arrival by the mentors. We dined together and engaged in socially and emotionally validating conversations with each learner. The academic environment was fully collaborative, process-oriented, and each learner was provided with learning material that was suited for their current ability levels. The children were also provided opportunities to have informal interactions with professionals from various walks of life. The children, after completing 500 academic hours, appeared for a few national-level competitive examinations to gain admission to certain fully residential state-owned public schools. And many of the children began to clear these examinations and gain admission to these prestigious institutions. The learners also designed an evolving textbook wherein the entire content is created by the learners. The families of these children are provided with positive happenings in the academic, social, and emotional realm of the children on a regular basis. This gives the families a sense of self-respect, and they start believing in their children. Over the last 5 years, we have managed to reach out to 500 plus families, and more than 20% of our learners have been placed in various residential public schools. The learners have overcome the challenge of the indigenous language and have begun competing with children who have better access to resources. The families are taking the initiative to reach out to schools, as regular interaction with teachers, and is seeing this as an opportunity to get onto the mainstream. The SEL embedded learning environments has provided us the opportunity to awaken the passion for learning in these young children. It has helped us connect with the community and understand their problems, and is creating a path which goes a long way in helping the community identify and problem solve many of the ills that they are facing right now. We are helping ensure social justice through this SEL initiative. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Gunjan Tomar from India. I am so happy to be here with you all. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Karanga Global SEL Conference for creating this platform for educators to share their good practices. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, I am Vinita Garg and we are so excited to share with you all our strategy to address social justice by integrating responsible decision making, an important component of SEL. So here we go. So our strategy is to address social justice by creating a community of responsible decision makers who are equipped to make ethical, constructive choices about personal and social behavior. Justice delayed is justice denied. It is effectively the same thing as having no remedy at all. Justice hurried is justice buried. When we think about this, it makes us understand that hasty decisions may lead to unproductive justice. This video of ours is an effort to create or work towards creating a community of responsible decision makers to make this world a better place for all. We all have it in us, and we all can do it collectively as a community. Presenting our activity to let students understand and reflect on what social justice is all about. Analyze these images and empathize to understand what they are reflecting. Choose any one image and record your understanding on Empathy Map. But before moving to Empathy Map, let's analyze what empathy involves. Put yourself in the situation of the picture chosen understand, and connect with it using empathy map. Your next step will be to reflect, analyze, synthesize, and evaluate the information to create or derive a solution that can help the world to change. You are a responsible decision maker. After solving this problem, ask for people's perspective about the same. If majority of them go with you, you are ready to go for it. If not, reconsider your solution. You have it in you and you can do it. Now you are good to go. Congratulations. You didn't delay the justice and you didn't hurry to make decision. So a well thought and balanced approach has made you a very important member of the community who is called a responsible decision maker, who will help others to join this community to make world a better place for all. Going further, let your voice reach masses. You have the ability to change the world to make it a better place to live for all. Remember, life was, is, will be beautiful always by practicing responsible decision making. Thank you.
The Bioescola program consists of an offer of environmental education and promotion of scientific culture provided by the municipality of Lousada to all local schools. It aims to encourage the commitment of young people to environmental issues and to urge knowledge, values and responsibilities for the protection and conservation of nature. The program is directed at all school levels, from kindergarten to secondary, and since we work with the same group of children over time, we had a perfect setting to evaluate and measure the pedagogical effectiveness of the program, both on short and on the long run. Thus, in partnership with the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation and its program, Gulbenkian Academies of Knowledge, we intended to implement the Wallis Problem Solving and SSES, Study on Social and Emotional Skills experimental methodologies, respectively to kindergarten and primary schools. These experimental methodologies aim to assess whether environmental teaching interventions within a school context generate greater cognitive development, an aggregation of emotional skills, the development of problem-solving competencies, and, in general, if the program contributes to the growth of a set of skills that allow for a better social involvement and self-regulation as part of the child's development. With the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting change in the school paradigm, and due to the unpredicted confinement and restrictions to physical contact inside or outside the school settings, the Bioescola program had to adapt. In such a unique situation, the aforementioned evaluation methods are impossible to implement with children. So, in order to continue to stimulate the target audience with ecological content and understand if there is indeed an improvement in the children's social skills, namely the problem-solving capacity, we have to completely redesign our approach. To this end, we proceeded with the creation of the Bioescola channel on YouTube, where we continue to promote environmental education through videos which content fit the official syllabus for each school level and subject tackled. After watching the videos, the parents are asked to assess if and how the program had an impact on their children. For this, survey links are available at the end of each video. Additionally, some subjects and classes were delivered by video on streaming. In this option, that was coordinated with each responsible teacher, environmental content was delivered in full safety, online, but maintaining an interactive dialogue and the bonding that the children had created with the Bioescola tutors. Obviously, this and other forms of program monitoring are an adaptation to this new reality, and these monitoring mechanisms do not fully replace the previously proposed ones. In this time of social distancing, it becomes now urgent to adapt and overcome, keeping the students socially and emotionally engaged to our program and to the whole community. We now need to evaluate the impact of the program on their social and emotional skills during these distancing times. This assessment and validation will allow us to obtain even more robust results, which will allow us to test and understand if an integrated environmental education program boosts indeed a greater cognitive development regarding emotional competences, more specifically regarding problem solving. This way, Bioescola and similar projects can contribute to a greater social health and self-regulation of children in such difficult and disturbed times.
Hi, my name is Kaylin, and the strategy I'd like to share with you today is called the Self-Regulation Toolbox. I'm a kindergarten teacher, but this is something that can be easily used and adapted for young learners all the way up to adult learners. The example I'm going to show you was co-created within my kindergarten classroom this year. And just to give you an idea, I would probably introduce this strategy a few months into the school year after students have already developed a vocabulary about emotions and feelings and noticing a little bit in their own bodies and brains how they're feeling. they would have already also had some guidance and some experience in different self-regulation strategies. And so that's why when we get to this point about October for me, when I ask them, what are some ways that make you feel better and make you feel ready to come back to learning when you're feeling frustrated, angry, silly, too excited, they came up with this list all by themselves. You can see that some things are going to be special and specific to materials I have in the classroom, but most things are very easily adaptable for any classroom. And after we create the big brainstorm together, what I do is I give each child a copy of this sheet printed off, and I allow them to pick and choose the strategies that are going to work best for them, because obviously we're all different as humans and different things are going to work in our own independent realities. So the children will cut and paste them into a card, and we keep them easily accessible inside the classroom. After that, either during practice time, they're invited by myself or another teacher to take their card and practice some of those strategies when they're feeling dysregulated. But what's also really exciting is that they're able to do this independently, and it really builds their independence in recognizing feelings and emotions and being able to do something about it. The children realize that they have agency, which is awesome. Just a warning, you will find when you first do this that all 20, 30 children in your class are wanting to use their toolbox at the same time. But trust me, with just some gentle guidance and allowing them to experiment for the first few times, they will get more independent and they will recognize when they really need this. So that is it for the regulation toolbox, and I hope you enjoy applying it in your own classroom.
All right, everybody. So thank you very much for taking the time to sit back and listen to some of those strategies that were shared from our SEL education community and the Gulbenkian Foundation. We're going to be taking just about 5 more minutes before we get started with the live session again. So take a break, relax, and we'll be getting started again in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We were really interested in exploring 3 themes across the conference today. We were interested in looking at the intersection of social emotional learning and social justice, the intersection of social emotional learning and hybrid learning models, and learnings about SEL in context of education and emergencies, because we felt that those 3 themes were particularly pertinent to the wider situation that so many of us find ourselves in at the moment. And this next panel discussion is going to focus on education in emergencies. Now, in so many ways, we are all in an education crisis at the moment, but some of us have been working in the EIE, the education and emergency space, for much longer, and there are some really interesting learning opportunities for mainstream K-12 education from how the education and emergency community have used social and emotional learning to support educators, to support learners, and to help achieve learning outcomes. The way we're going to run the panel is, in a couple of seconds, each of the panelists is going to briefly introduce themselves and say a little about where they've worked and the contexts that they're drawing from. And we'll go Randa first, and then Danielle, and then Jacob, and they'll each speak for 1 or 2 minutes just to introduce themselves. And after that, Danielle and Randa are going to have a bit of a conversation about ways in which they have used social and emotional learning, or they've seen social and emotional learning used in pre-COVID-19 contexts. Then we'll bring in Jacob, who's going to talk about some of the amazing work that his institute has been involved in around gamification of social and emotional learning practices, specifically in the COVID-19 context. And then we will have a general conversation amongst the 4 of us. We'll try and make it as interactive as possible. So if you have questions for the panel, please post them in the chat function, and I will try and bring as many of them to the panel's attention as possible. But first of all, we'll do that quick round of introductions, if that's okay. So Randa, if you kick us off.
Thank you so much, Dominic. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with all of you and sharing ideas and thoughts. I've just watched the previous panel, and that alone was very inspiring. So my name is Randa. I work as the Social Emotional Learning Senior Specialist at the International Rescue Committee, which is an INGO that has really paved the way to using social emotional learning in various kinds of education and emergency context or post-conflict contexts, from West Africa to areas in the Middle East, to East Asian countries, and really now starting to work in the Latin American communities. So we have such a versatile and wide range of social emotional learning programming that we've done before, but some areas that really interest me are integration into academic subjects. So how do we integrate social emotional learning into academic subjects? How do we contextualize and adapt our SEL frameworks and priorities when we start working in a new community that's never seen social emotional learning before? And also research around social emotional learning. So how do we measure it? Why is it so hard to measure social emotional learning? And trying to solve some of these issues that we face when low resource and low capacity settings.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Danielle.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle de la Fuente, founder and director of Amal Alliance. Pleased to be here. So at Amal Alliance, we're an NGO that also has been working in the education emergence sphere well before COVID, specifically providing 4 pillars of support. So social emotional learning, psychosocial support, early childhood development, and peace education. And we've been doing this in Greece, Lebanon, and Turkey, primarily in refugee camps or informal settlements. And how we sort of deliver our SEL programming is housed in what we call our rainbow of education. So it is for kids. So imagine a rainbow where, you know, colors correspond with themes, such as red being emotions and green being compassion, blue empathy. And the idea is to deliver all these SEL competencies through different methods like kids yoga, dance, art therapy, creative writing, reading, dance, and just fun. So yeah, and I'll pass the ball over to Jacob to tell us a little bit about his work.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having all of us. It's really great. So I'm the director of a Center for Hybrid Intelligence in Aarhus in Denmark, and a citizen science project which is called Science at Home, where we specialize in trying to build sort of citizen science games, so online games, and use those for engagement around the world. And in terms of SEL, we are involved in 2 projects, or 2 types of projects in the digital space. And one of them is that we are trying to develop new tools, sort of the collaborative tools that facilitate social inclusion in the classroom. So if you have project-based learning or inquiry-based science education, which is sort of maybe education at its best, how do we actually sort of facilitate a classroom discussion that can become inclusive? And we're seeing teachers around the world doing that fantastically, but we're also seeing that this is one of the biggest challenges. And the question is, could digital sort of tools be a scaffolding in order to do that? And so that's one of the branches that we're working on. And then the second one is to try to use these games as sort of safe barriers, safe sort of ports of entry for discussion around sort of SEL-related topics like self-reflection and metacognition. So we have a number of different types of citizen science games. And first, we sort of invite the students in to help us in a research project on a grand theme. And that could be sort of, for instance, understanding what creativity is. So we have a portfolio trying to create sort of understanding of what creativity is and how to measure creativity. And then once the students are sort of in that safe space of helping our researchers in that process, then we can also sort of turn the viewpoint inwards, and we can have activities in which they sort of have self-reflection and metacognition around that. We can talk more about that later.
Amazing, thank you, Jacob. So we're going to roll the clock back slightly to a pre-COVID world, if anyone can remember what that was like. And Randa and Danielle are going to speak for a bit now about work that they were involved in that took place and was designed in a, I'm not quite sure what the right phrase is, in a more conventional emergency context, if such a thing exists, or a more localized emergency context.
Sure, would you like me to kick off, Dominic?
Sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, so obviously we were working in crisis before COVID. And so I had mentioned the rainbow of education. And really what we were trying to do was create a very holistic programming that touched upon all the different stages of development and really focused on SEL as a primary source of intervention. And with that, we use kids yoga as an emphasis, as well as mindfulness. Because there's a lot of really great ways to, get the body moving and also use your breath to regulate the nervous system. We use a very trauma-informed play-based approach. So learning through play and integrating that aspect of dance and teamwork and, learning how to identify your emotions. But then once you identify it, then how do you regulate your emotions? So bringing in those SEL competencies. And so the idea is that as you move through the rainbow, so as you go from color to color, you essentially develop your foundational social emotional competencies. So it's not a one-stop shop. I always say we envision ourselves sort of like a relay race where, kids come to us and then we pass the baton to make sure that they can get into the national school system or whatever it is that follows, sort of what Randa was mentioning earlier. So to really set them up on a pathway towards success. And this is done through training organizations on the ground. So, really thinking about sustainability and how we can empower and capacitate the locals. So we train teachers from the refugee community and they in turn impart our curricula. It's fantastic. They bring their own creativity and imagination to the lesson plans. But it also really becomes theirs, and it helps with the localization and making sure that it's culturally appropriate and all these different things that need to be taken into account as you're developing, right? And Randa, I think you have some amazing examples with IRC. You guys do fantastic work on the ground. And so, I mean, maybe we can kind of tell us a bit more and I'll jump back.
So I really like that that the Amal Alliance uses mindfulness, because that's something that we've been trying and that we've tried several times over the years in many different contexts, but I don't know, like in a lot of the contexts that we work in, SEL is such a new and like crazy topic. Mindfulness is even more so kind of adventurous and often rejected very quickly by host communities. And that's because there are misinterpretations about whether it's religiously affiliated or whether, it conflicts with some of those larger concepts. But trying to clarify these conceptual differences in a very simple way is difficult. IRC also likes to take a trauma-informed approach, and that's why in our social emotional learning framework, one of the things that we do differently than a lot of other frameworks is that we include, it's sort of as tangential, but really it makes like an essential basis and a part of our SEL framework, and that's brain building, so executive functioning skills, because there's a lot of research and evidence to support that the fact that trauma affects the development of the brain, and social emotional learning, and specifically focusing on brain building skills and executive functioning skills, can reverse the negative effects of toxic stress on the brain. So that's why we decided to include it as a major component and the foundation in our framework. And like you said, we do work on multiple levels. So IRC starts, or in the past has worked a lot on the classroom level, so creating classroom materials, teacher trainings, teacher well-being and student well-being. So also in the event of an emergency or a crisis, some of the most important factors that I think also weigh into how we're approaching COVID-19 include, creating a sense of control in the classroom, like allowing children to have some routine, some control, some familiarity, and a sense of safety in where they are. And those can easily be done with very simple teaching practices or home practices now. And I guess maybe some of the last things that we were doing when we were trying to expand a little bit more, we were trying to include more system strengthening programs into our approach, not just direct services in classrooms with teachers and caregivers and students. So we really wanted to start working with leaders, so school leadership, principals, and then engaging the community in a larger way so that SEL can just become part of the conversation around neighbors and around families who know each other. So it's not something that they just have to go to school and feel like it's a subject that they learn, but rather like a communal change that they're all embarking in. And you could do that through multimedia or through different kinds of learning circles that involve members of the community. But I'd love to hear more about Jacob and what the work has been before COVID-19, what the focus was.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're both saying. Also with the brain building skills and sort of the focus on the robustness and building the resilience, because so that's one of the things that let's say pre-COVID that we were working a lot on is, for instance, building games for assessing executive functions. So that's a part of a research question. Can we do that? And if we can do that, can we use that in classrooms? Can we use that in clinical settings and all kinds of things? And so it's a research project, but then we're also asking a question, which I think is interesting in relation to that, and that is sort of the coping strategies, because I think that one of the sort of biggest and most important steps to resilience is really to say, okay, well, how can we sort of live with and accept with and actually love the person that we are, right? And so building that individuality is something really crucial. So what we're trying to do is sort of take those games, show you, for instance, what your short-term memory or your visual spatial recognition skills are, and then rather than saying that it's good that you are sort of good at this and good at this and good at that, then we sort of try to build narratives of how being sort of a low scoring on something drives you to different kinds of coping mechanisms that builds your character and builds the unique sort of superhero that you are. And I think that's sort of this superhero approach is something that's really, really interesting. One of the cases that I found really interesting was sort of a number of world-class mathematicians. We tell this story about these mathematicians. They actually had a lousy working memory, but then in their early years, they always sort of, because they had such a lousy working memory, they had to sort of rederive all of the equations on the whiteboard. And that actually meant that they started thinking much more in terms of mathematics. So that's an example how we can sort of, by creating that playful space of knowing who you are, we can sort of draw the focus not on how good you are or how different you are, but saying that we are all different and we all have these coping strategies that can sort of be remarkable. And I think coping strategy is something that we can all learn more about.
Jacob, I love that you mentioned superheroes for a variety of reasons, because actually to answer something you just said, Randa, it's true. Oftentimes mindfulness and even yoga has this very weird connotation of like, oh, is this some strange cult? And so there's this backlash. And so one of the ways that we teach mindfulness is actually through superhero breaths. So, you know, kind of reframing that package. I mean, obviously we're all breathe, we're alive because we breathe. And so just learning how, you know, oh, if you're a superhero, well, how does Batman breathe? And you're teaching children how to learn to breathe like Batman or Spider-Man, and then transcending that notion of like, well, you know, meditation or mindfulness, it doesn't have to be this experience. It could be something really fun and playful that you can do as you're, you know, pretending to be Batman. And so when you frame it in this way, it doesn't become this, oh, this SEL becomes a strange new addition. It's just a regular activity that becomes really, really playful. But yeah, that's something that has definitely come up in the past. Like, what is mindfulness and this yoga thing?
And just to add on that, because I know that one of the original questions we wanted to answer in this panel is the difference or like the distinction between SEL and psychosocial support. And just like as another like misinterpretation that commonly happens with the two of them, I think the way that we think about SEL, it's something that everyone can experience. So not only children, not only adults, but I mean, everyone in the classroom all at once has the same exposure to social emotional learning. And it's really important to explain to teachers who are new to SEL that this isn't a way to diagnose someone with any particular issue. I think psychosocial support is something that comes sort of at a level just past social emotional learning, and allows you to have better screening of individuals who need more individualized support for well-being specifically. But SEL is something that everyone should constantly be working on from childhood, from ECD even up to adulthood. And that's something that we're constantly working on. It's really important to emphasize that it's not gonna be something that you just like achieve and end up, you know, like now you're done. Now you're the well-rounded human being that's gonna succeed in life.
Do you want to just comment again on the sort of building the bridge between SEL and then sort of the academic topics? So because it shouldn't be something that is just sort of out there. It should be integrated into the curriculum, right?
Yeah, it's funny because something that we once heard when introducing SEL in one of our, I think, East African countries. I don't want to say the wrong one, but I think it was Uganda probably. But I remember, Tanzania. But I remember that when we introduced social emotional learning as a subject with dedicated time during the day, children were saying like, we love the games, we love SEL, but it's like the hardest subject. We didn't understand exactly what about it was difficult for them to capture. And then maybe it's just the name social emotional learning, for example. Maybe it's the idea that it's extra work for them. Maybe it's something that they haven't had to do before, which is to do a lot of the self-reflection, to think a lot about these concepts and become self-aware in a way that's honestly like very taxing mentally and cognitively and emotionally. It is very tasking to ask people to reach inside them and like recall these feelings that they're having when they're not used to doing that and not know exactly how to address them. So I think we have a huge responsibility, especially in the context that we work in, to not just come in and do 5 months of programming and then say like, peace out, you know, like good luck dealing with your problems, but really making sure that we're not doing any harm and we're building the coping skills. I mean, not just coping skills, but like the ability to understand, reflect, and then also know how to manage and how to move forward from those reflections. Yeah. I don't know if you faced anything similar.
And Randa, I think you touched upon something really important too, because I mean, the fact is we're working in context that there's tremendous amount of trauma, you know, whether it's been through displacement or natural disaster. And so there's already these lived experiences. And as you're working towards, you know, self-reflection, it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult for someone who hasn't survived some sort of trauma. So much more difficult for someone who has. And oftentimes you can do more harm if it's not the intervention isn't administered correctly. And so, you know, as practitioners, we have to be really cognizant of the fact of how are we relaying these skills? How is it being delivered? You know, what is the content? You know, is it culturally appropriate? Is it age appropriate? Because, you know, we work with early childhood and primary. So something that we would do with a 3-year-old is not the same that we would do with a 12-year-old. And I believe, I mean, you work in various different age groups. And I think, Jacob, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're mainly in primary and secondary. Is that correct? Okay, but just also like really understanding these different age brackets, how it feeds into, you know, their community, and something that they can take home and share as well. So it's not something like, oh, I've gone and learned this and now I'm back, you know, at home, and this is not something that I've taken with me. So just something to think about.
So I think one of the really interesting questions around the trauma that you're talking about is really, how do we create safe spaces to sort of reflect on your own personal experiences? And I think that's the big challenge in all of these educational sort of modules, is how can we do that? In our project, we were I was at least personally sort of very inspired by this project called Step Inside the Circle, which is this sort of 200 hardened criminals in an American prison, standing in a big circle, and then in the middle there's this frail woman, and this frail woman is just saying, take one step into the circle if you have experienced sort of childhood abuse or something. And then 90% of them step in, and in the end they sort of all stepped in and they are hugging each other, because they got this sort of experience of moving from them feeling sort of special, and let's say special in a bad sense, to seeing that everyone else also had these kinds of problems. But of course, this is extremely fragile to expose each other and ourselves at that time. So how can we create these interfaces where it's safe? And I think you're working on that, and we're working on it, maybe doing the digital interfaces. But in the physical world, how do you create that safe space?
There's a very no, I'll just do a quick suggestion. But one, I mean, the risk with having those, I think the reason people like tend towards those kind of activities, and even in SEL, like you'll find some curricula that encourages these like become vulnerable, like extreme exposure of your experiences, and then let's have the shared experience that is the healing process itself. It's dangerous. It's dangerous if it's not being facilitated by someone who has like a high capacity to read the room and the situation and know who needs special attention or like who needs care in that moment. And I think one just very simple thing that people could do if they are tending towards those kinds of activities is just make sure you have a very good debrief at the end of the session. And that debrief doesn't have to be where you comment or you point out or whatever on specific examples of what people said or shared, but rather just like allowing them a moment to reflect on the shared experience, and then finding a way to kind of level out and not leave the activity in a high emotional state, but rather in a calm one. What about you, Danielle?
Yeah, so definitely everything you just said, and you know, creating that safe environment, but really restoring that sense of normalcy and routine, so that it becomes sort of something to look forward to, something that you know has become part of your routine. So it doesn't become a something else. It's just kind of restoring that that routine that you didn't have. But also, you know, it's really key to observe when you're working with children. I mean, kids will tell you so many things, whether it be in words or in body language or actions. You know, I remember a story in Turkey. I was working in Turkey and we had maybe 20 children in the classroom, and there was this one little boy that was very, very much not wanting to be part of the classroom, and he wasn't being rebellious or anything like that. You could just tell that there was something that wasn't correct. Something was off, and he was shy and he was recluse, and so really just noticing the fact that you know he wasn't keeping up with the class. So I was very fortunate that I was there observing, because we had just trained the teachers, so I was able to kind of let the class go on, and I took the child aside and I said, look, let's do this together. You know, let's do all the activities together. Like, forget about the rest of the kids. And as he started feeling a little bit more comfortable, he lifted up his pant legs, and I wasn't expecting this, because you know what it was very, very brutalized scars and legs, and I mean, I literally my heart just sank. And you know, what are you to do in the situation where you're in a room with 20 children and teachers, and you know, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not equipped to deal with that. But so I wanted him to know that he was safe and it was okay, and that I was seeing him and I was acknowledging him. So I just put my hands on his legs and smiled, and we sat there kind of just holding each other, me just touching his legs for about, you know, a few minutes. It felt forever, and we smiled. And then he hugged me, but then I referred this particular child later I flagged it like, okay, that obviously something's going on. There's some sort of abuse or more extreme trauma, but it was really based on observation. And so as teachers and facilitators, we really need to understand who we're working with, flag those special cases, but just make sure that they feel comfortable enough to feel some sort of vulnerability and express it healthily.
And if the program is just in the form of like a curriculum that's written down, making sure that that curriculum includes those tips for sensitivity, includes like a basic child protection training that everyone should go through before starting SEL,
Exactly.
But yeah, these challenges are all like doubled and tripled when we start talking about the emergency context in COVID-19.
That feels like a perfect moment to pivot to the other theme that we were interested in exploring. I think there's two really interesting examples of practice that sort of run across all of your work, but I think particularly Danielle and Randa's, that one is the kind of play-based nature of it and making it fun as a way of helping with the healing, but also the importance of the environment and the learning environment and the space in which this takes place. And in many ways, those are two of the things that have been wrenched away at the moment because schools or many different kinds of learning environments aren't convening or meeting in the same way. And so I wondered, across the three of you, what experiences you've had or what practice you've seen of applying those kinds of approaches in the reality of our current pandemic.
Anybody want to start?
Yeah. Well, so I can start with our efforts where we had sort of a little bit of a head start because we were already digital, but then the question is really sort of back to this question: how can we create these sort of safe spaces? And as I mentioned in the beginning, we try to do that through games, and in one of the games we sort of created a completely new game called the Corona Minister, which deals with sort of putting the student in the shoes of the Corona Minister, we call it, so the person who is to make all of the decisions about how to sort of handle the pandemic. And so the purpose of that was to draw the attention away from just focusing on a red curve and a blue and a green curve and sort of minimizing the number of casualties in this, but also drawing attention to the complexity that it is if you are really the prime minister and you are trying to navigate a whole country safely through that. Then it's really important to know that it's not just sort of the numbers that are the COVID numbers that are important. It's also the economy, which we know is going to have huge impacts in the long run. But it's also sort of subtle issues like the mental health, because we can put all kinds of restrictions. We can shut down the country, but then we will have mental health issues popping up, and they will also have sort of very long-term consequences. And so what we try to do in this game is that you are sort of the Corona Minister to create your personal balance between all those different kinds of let's say, trade-offs and navigate through that system. So that means that we start off by saying the governments around the world actually need your voice. So we need those sort of the social awareness of you to sort of step into the shoes and seeing the complexity of that. And then once we have that space established, we try to sort of turn inward. And then with a couple of hundred students, the last couple of weeks, we had sort of a Zoom session in which we asked them to sort of reflect inwards. And then we use sort of digital interfaces and sort of a little bit sort of fancy shuttling them into different kinds of rooms so that they could sort of pseudo-anonymously write about their own personal reflections in it. So we had a sheet that in which they could all write into that, and then we came into a sort of a shared 5-person room, and then they picked the sort of the topics that they thought were really interesting. And the idea was that they could then sort of pick their own ones, but in a pseudo-anonymous way, and then they could have that reflection process that we just talked about before, but in a sort of a slight, safe, distant way, but they could still sort of discuss their own emotions and feelings. And it was just really sort of gratifying to see how across those digital rooms, there was lots of conversation going on, and they were typing away, and we made these sort of kinds of word clouds of both positive effects and negative effects that came through that. So that's an example of trying to create those safe spaces and seeing if we can mimic the real world in the digital world and learn sort of from the best of the two.
What were some of the results of like what children thought of as priorities during COVID-19?
So that was one of the sort of the wonderful things that when they talked about sort of the society, they varied completely across the board, because some of them thought economics is just the most important thing. We need to just get through it, and that's the most important thing. Some people said privacy settings are really important, because because that's sort of the untold stories that affect us. And so it was a really interesting conversation where among just a group of 5 students who were talking about it and collaborating on creating those solutions, they could see the divergences in opinion, and it was okay to be respectful of it, because our own prime minister didn't have the solution for that. And at the same time, there was also sort of really gratifying to see how when it started to turn inwards, there was also these common themes of how they were affected, and I could hear in some of the conversations saying, okay, well, I recognize that. Well, okay, that was also something that I was affected. I'm also feeling lonely and slightly depressed for these things, and they started to feel sort of a union in sharing those experiences.
Jacob, could you share the word clouds, or Dominic, I don't know, because, we had the pleasure of seeing this before, and something that I absolutely loved about what you did was the fact that there was this one word cloud that was a little bit, uncertain and, a little bit more grim, but then there was a very hopeful word cloud. And I think that would be really nice to show.
Yes, Dominic, do you have it? Or?
Sorry for putting you guys on the spot, but I just think it's so useful.
Yeah, do you want me to bring them up now?
Sure, yeah, that would be nice. Just seeing how lots of the students said, so family is a big thing, and hobbies. So we see here, physical exercise, and sort of just more time spent. Creativity are sort of some of the positive stories coming out of that. And then, of course, on the other side, it's some of the things that we've heard about, but still it becomes very tangible when it's said there, and also sort of for them to see their own words written up there and written sort of in a bold font also shows that they're not alone in that way.
Lovely, I love it. Well, I know, Randa, you and I sort of, we talked about similar things when we chatted earlier. So in our case, with COVID, we had to come up with an entirely different model, because primarily we were working in person. And so we actually spearheaded a consortium with Karanga and Salzburg Global Seminar and Qatar Foundation, all sorts of wonderful folks. And so the idea was to really provide an intervention that was useful, that would reach individuals that maybe didn't have access to Wi-Fi, that were living in maybe tents or containers that, where you couldn't social distance, and where, hygiene was already an issue prior to COVID. And on top of that, you might have multi-generational families in one unit. So there might be someone very elderly and a 3-year-old and a 16-year-old. So what we created was a podcast series. And so the idea is that it was all on well-being. So touched about all sorts of different topics, from coping mechanisms to hygiene, to tolerance, to resilience. And it was administered through WhatsApp. So imagine a really long voice note, but with practical guidance and activities. So something really, really simple where families could, draw and paint together without having any materials, where they're using their fingers and tracing the clouds, or they're doing activities and games that foster, excellent health and well-being. But at the same time, it's something that doesn't require space nor supplies, and they can do as a family unit. So it was a 6-episode series. We distributed it in 4 languages. And let me tell you, I had no idea how hard it was to create a podcast. And I know, Randa, I think IRC did similar things, right?
We're planning. I can speak a little bit about what the immediate phase of our responses were, because like I mentioned, we do work in such a wide range of contexts. So even within the same country, we're looking at places that have zero contact to any internet, no devices. The school also happens to be the safest place where people go, and suddenly they can't go there anymore. So what do you do? What do you do in a context like that? I think in part of our immediate phase was to make sure that we had a bunch of program adaptation guidance materials so that our country programs could take the leadership on figuring out what's ongoing right now, what kind of support do children most immediately need, and the answer often included social emotional learning in almost everywhere. Everyone is now interested in social emotional learning, even more than before, just because it's the most obvious need when everyone is trapped at home, or when families are suffering, or when people have lost their jobs. There is a strong need for SEL right now. I think in a part of our immediate phases, I noticed that a lot of organizations were creating materials really rapidly, even though there wasn't enough time to do proper testing or assessment, a needs assessment to figure out what do people need right now? What are people going to use? And so that we don't replicate our efforts, our previous efforts and efforts of organizations. And most especially, we wanted to be working in collaboration with the Ministry of Education's efforts in countries. So we didn't want to be, as an NGO, we didn't want to be working against or changing priorities for what the government or what the ministries wanted. And then, you know, the biggest challenge was access, like I described. So we had to be really creative with how we could adapt some of our existing SEL material, not necessarily the ones that are meant for classrooms, because we have SEL material that are just activities on cards that could be played by anyone. And then once they become familiar, the children will even know how to play it and can direct it themselves. So we started with really adapting existing content, mapping out the content that we would need and the gaps areas, and then trying to do some virtual testing and needs assessments based on, like, to answer the questions about how are we going to access the most vulnerable and what kind of topics and materials do they need the most. And then after that, we had like a secondary phase, which we're in kind of right now, and that's developing all this audio and visual content, like you described, Danielle. Basically, we had a big program, a very large program in Lebanon that involved working on multiple levels in social emotional learning. So all the way from the classroom level with the students, activities in the classroom, up to the Ministry of Education folks and training staff from the Ministry of Education on social emotional learning, because they wanted to include SEL. This is pre-COVID, but they wanted to include SEL into all the national school public system, so 900 public schools. So that was what was happening before COVID-19. And now after COVID-19, they still want to include social emotional learning. It's the top priority, but we have to create content like mad people. And suddenly this NGO is now a video production company, and we never really knew that that was gonna happen to us. But thankfully, IRC has already been trying to innovate for the last 5 years. Like, we've been trying to include audio, visuals, apps, other kinds of innovative approaches to respond to some of the results that we were getting on our behavioral insights. So we wanted people to actually be doing SEL, and we wanted to make it as easy as possible for them to do SEL. So thankfully, we have some foundation around that. And so we've created social emotional learning videos. We've created these PowerPoints with voiceovers facilitating lessons as though the child was in the classroom that have SEL integrated into it. This happens to be the one project I'm just describing as an example. And now we're about to embark on a larger program with LEGO, creating an audio program. It's for social emotional learning, specifically around COVID-19. And the hope is that we create around 10 episodes or 12 episodes with a set of characters who talk directly to the children, that allow them to do physical activities at home so they can guide them through actual activities, but also it could be storytelling, it could be creating a shared experience. So if it's broadcast on the radio, you would know, for example, that other people are listening to it as well, because they also have this particular sign, or they also have, or they've been, they've shared in some way that they've been listening to the same thing. So I think that also can help with reminding people that the COVID-19 situation is not something that's inflicted on them as an individual, but really just a shared experience that everyone has to go through.
So I have a quick question for maybe both of you, if I can just ask quickly. Sorry, but I was just really interested in finding out what your thoughts are on sort of the effect of the digitization process that you're going through now, in terms of both scaling up and getting more data and being able to evaluate more efficiently. Of course, all of that happens. Do you have any experience or thoughts about how that's going to affect the post-COVID sort of period? And are we learning something that we are sort of taking back, and that the whole world is going to be better in that way after this?
Danielle, go ahead.
Yeah, so the short answer is, I mean, I was not at all involved in the digitization sphere, and it's been a learning process even for myself. But I think it's fantastic, and I think COVID has presented an opportunity to reimagine learning, where it's sort of like a hybrid approach of both the in-person and the digital, because obviously there's certain things, especially with social emotional, that have to be started in person. You really need to build those relationships, build that trust, but then you can support in so many more ways through just a digital form. And I do think the monitoring and evaluating will maybe take some time just to catch up, just because in general it's been a challenge regardless, but pre-COVID. But I think if we really get creative and start addressing like, well, what are the indicators that we're measuring? Like, what are we trying to look at? I mean, let's use technology to our advantage.
Yeah. As personally, on a very, very personal level, so I'm not speaking to the whole organization, but when I came into the NGO world, I really came hoping to develop videos. So I kind of come in years ago with this like hope and expectation that we could really like take some of these very old traditional classroom materials that NGOs have been doing for years. They all look the same. And they're great. A lot of them are really, really great and have amazing technical content in them and like really, really strong expertise, but they're not being used, or they're being used incorrectly because of the format that they're in. So this has been an awesome side effect, the fact that we're finally pushed into innovating and that we're pushed towards creating technological solutions to respond to COVID-19. I think it's great, but it's not only great for us as organizations, it's great for families at home. Who I just ran into someone in the deli the other day here in New York who was saying that for the first time he's had to help his children with homework because he's learning about Google Classroom and all these things, which we're taking on as well. So I can imagine this is the same experience our beneficiaries are having, but they're gaining skills that they haven't had before. This is really going to open up the possibilities of the kind of programming that we do. And it's finally going to push caregivers and parents who are kind of like the hardest to capture in a lot of these communities to engage them in social emotional learning as a topic of relevancy for their children. So I'm excited about it. And thankfully we have an innovation department that has a lot of designers who already help us in this aspect. But yeah, I think now it's just gaining for us as practitioners, gaining the skill of really transforming what exists in curriculum and written content to something a bit more.
I also have another question, follow, just quick. I'm just curious, what is your sort of top number one social emotional learning sort of skill or aspect that is really difficult to digitize? Because we're starting to harvest some of the fruits, right?
Building relationships. It's hard to build trust on a screen. And the foundation of interaction is that social connection. So it can be done, and it can definitely be done with games. I mean, you saw how people were connected even through the word cloud, but it takes an added layer and a little bit more meaningful thought put into it.
I don't know if I agree 100% with that, just because people are connecting on the internet this day and age, like as a primary way of connecting with people. Like, I don't think connecting or making relationships or connecting with people is the difficult skill. I think it's something a bit more higher level than that, which is like, let's say conflict resolution. I think conflict resolution is something really, really difficult to do online, not just online, but to create a game or not a game necessarily, but like an activity or a simulated experience of conflict resolution that's actually genuine, that really helps a child not only visualize and internalize what the conflict is, but really to think of solutions in a way that would happen, that would replicate in real life. That's been the hardest for me personally to like visualize and see, because I think for all the other skills, you can still try to find a creative way, but conflict is very, very, very specific. It's very like inherent to people's nature, and it's very like context specific. So, and people can't see eye to eye with each other when they can't communicate clearly and directly. And I think doing that virtually is just another barrier blocking communication between people. So I would say, like, basically just taking what Danielle said, but really more like on the conflict level.
So maybe
all those non-visual cues, I can.
Sorry.
Danielle, please. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, a lot of the way we teach conflict resolution with kids is, we role play. And I feel like role play can easily be turned into sort of a virtual scenario. So, we can talk more offline. I'd be very curious to chat more about this. But I could see it easily being transformed through role play.
To me, sort of empathy and trust are sort of two things that are really difficult. So they are sort of the key also to what Randa is saying, right? And those are the challenges to build. And just reflecting on these kinds of skills and these challenges is going to sort of make us smarter in how we can build these both digital and non-digital interfaces of the future, I think.
Yeah.
We are almost at time. This has been the easiest panel that I've ever had to moderate in my entire life, because I was completely redundant from the second minute. So Jacob, Danielle and Randa, thank you so much for sharing all of those insights. I think the final 5 minutes of the conversation also set up the next discussion brilliantly, because as you come to parents and the role of parents and caregivers in supporting learning at the moment, it's a natural segue into the hybrid learning discussion. I could also see Mark chomping at the bit to come in when we were talking about the capacity for building relationships.
Right.
So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Mark and the final discussing group for the last part of this conference today.
Awesome. Okay, thanks so much, Dominic. Hey, welcome everybody to the online conference. You know, there's been lots of vigorous debates from the wee hours of the morning here in Seattle, where I'm coming to you from our 5 a.m. start all the way through till now. You know, joining us to explore this topic around hybrid learning, we've got some fantastic people. I'll introduce them a little bit more as I introduce them to come onto the virtual stage and talk for about 6 or 7 minutes around this topic from their perspective and their point of view. But, you know, you can see on the screen, we have Mia, we have Karen joining us and Joanne joining us. If you haven't met me, Mark Sparvell, a boring old school principal and teacher. I currently work for Microsoft Education here, but also lead the community of practice, the SEL in Edu group with Matt Pearsall, which is the preferred community of practice for Salzburg. During this session, friends who are joining us, could I encourage you to be active in social media? If you're using Twitter, use the hashtag SELinedu. Add the tag to it. That way somebody from the Salzburg group or the Karanga executive, we can grab that and retweet that against our handles. That would be awesome. And don't forget that, you know, this session plus all sessions are available if you go to karanga.org afterwards, and you can track those down, or also through their YouTube channel. So we're going to be talking about hybrid learning and the function that social and emotional learning has within these new models of education. A hybrid model, a hybrid combines, if you like, the best of elements. It's a fusion, it's a composite. And if you look at it in a biological sense, it's where you bring the best characteristics of some separate organisms and you bring them together to create a hybrid. And sometimes something happens which is called hybrid vigor. It's a biological term. And hybrid vigor happens when two organism characteristics are joined, but the output is different. It's smarter, it's taller, it's more agile or responsive. It's somehow different and at times improved from the individual characteristics of the parents. So that kind of leads us to ponder around this sort of world of hybrid learning, which we're going to dig into shortly. 2 papers have been released in the last week around this topic. Microsoft released a paper with new pedagogies for deep learning, Education Reimagined, which details the shift from traditional school learning in a physical school through remote learning to a potential hybrid model, and looks through a lens of equity, well-being, quality learning, health and safety. Today, McKinsey and Company Global Practice released with UNESCO a gigantic paper which picks up, and I'll pop these links down in the pane, which picks up this topic of COVID response hybrid learning. And it situates learning within, again, a context of health and safety, re-enrollment, especially for those who are most vulnerable, technical platforms. It picks up remediation issues. It talks about the planning for resurgence, and it spends a lot of time talking about what is this hybrid learning model? What are the new skills, capabilities, and dispositions young people will need? So we're going to hear from our fabulous panelists, and we're going to be starting off with Mia Doses. She's the Vice President of Innovation at Committee for Children and could be described as a social entrepreneur. She's interested in how do we support educators, families and directly children to embed social and emotional learning as part of their everyday life. She's been an advisor to organisations like Sesame Workshop, Born This Way Foundation, Lady Gaga's foundation, and even the Cartoon Network. She was involved in a literature review project recently which picked up distance learning around intentional practices. So she's well situated to talk around this topic. Mia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark. And is everybody hearing me okay before I go
Yeah.
to my screen? Terrific. Okay, I'm going to work on share screen here, and hopefully this is going to work out all right.
We have complete faith in your technical capacity here.
Well, the fun thing is I'm on a new computer, and
Oh, that's good. That's always important to introduce variables when you're in front of a large audience.
I know. Let's see. It is, I know that you have a copy of it, and so we may need to resort to that. Darn. I am.
Mia, do you want me to bring it up? I've got a copy here that I can show for you.
I think that would be what I'm going to need to do, unfortunately.
While you're doing that, what I'm going to do is introduce Joe and then possibly Karen, and then we can just move from one to the other. That way we don't need to sort of have complicated, awkward segues. We'll have Jojo would be joining us directly after Mia, and we're delighted to have her. She's a passionate advocate for all children learning about who they are, where they fit in, and importantly, how they can contribute positively and purposefully in their own lives and then ultimately in broader societies. Jo is the CEO and the co-founder of The Learner First. That's an international consultancy, and she's also on the executive committee of Karanga, and she'll be following up the fabulous Mia. Mia, we can see your slide and it looks gorgeous in shades of blue. If you're ready to go, the floor is yours.
I'm so happy we were prepared to have another one sent. Thank you so much. And I'll just have Dominic advance when I'm ready. So thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Mark said, I'm with Committee for Children, and we're a 40-year-old nonprofit that has been promoting children's safety and well-being through social emotional learning for many decades. And we do this both through advocacy and education. And the education part of that is primarily via our social emotional learning curriculum second step, which is used widely around the United States and around the world, reaching about 17 million children worldwide every year. And you can advance the slide. So a few weeks ago, our board of directors actually asked us to put together a review of what we knew about what works about distance learning. And so we have a research team at Committee for Children, and they put together this review and wrote up the key findings. And I want to start with just a few caveats in that, you know, it's very early for us to have had any rigorous research done on the outcomes of distance learning and what we've really learned from the COVID time. So this is kind of over time what we know about distance learning in general. And a lot of the studies are done with older students, with older teens and young adults. So I want to put that out there. And then when we're talking about social emotional learning as opposed to other topics, that's also sort of an area where there's a gap of what we know works really well for distance learning. And as we know, most SEL curricula is designed to be taught in person, so that that we know that it provides an extra challenge when trying to teach remotely. So having said that, there are some factors, and we can change the slide, that our team found that support better remote learning and thus better remote learning outcomes. And you'll see those here. The first, executive function skills, which for each individual student, we know that students who have better ability to self-regulate, to pay attention and have better motivation, have a much more successful time with remote learning. The next is student engagement. And we know that there are elements of student engagement that are very important, can be ported to remote learning around autonomy, around belonging to a learning community, and around competence. And then finally, family engagement, which is a big piece. And while this is always important in traditional learning, it's even more important when family members are suddenly becoming the teachers, the monitors, the providers of feedback. And of course, it's a much bigger challenge for some than others. And it's a much bigger challenge depending on how young the students are. And overall, then there's the overarching issue of access. And so that is something that it sort of affects all aspects. And we know that that is access in hardware or in internet, or just access to materials from the schools. And Dominic, you can change. So given that, we're focusing on a number of areas that I'm sure some of these we'll be talking about today, that you can see here, talking about developing platform features that are better designed for distance education. So often the programs have students working together in pairs, or as I heard in the previous group, doing role plays. Of course, those are very, very different when you have either students either online or just at home. And then there's the family engagement piece again that we're really leaning into, and that's the work that I've been doing. And so hopefully we'll have more conversation about that. We're working on offerings around stress and anxiety. We know that there is going to be a lot of students and educators who experience trauma, and heading back into this next school year, we want to be able to address those things. Looking at other tiers 2 and 3 adaptations, screenings and assessments, adaptations, other accessibility supports, and of course, translations. And next slide. And so just very briefly, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about this, I wanted to talk about a project that we're doing on the innovation team here at Committee for Children. That's the team that I run, our innovation department. And we do all kinds of things that are related to social emotional learning, and mostly with families. So we have a very robust group of teams working on curriculum at Committee for Children. And then my group works on coming up with new ideas. We're kind of like a team of little startups doing multiple little projects, all focused on bringing social and emotional learning outside the school walls. One way that we were doing that is with this podcast called The Imagined Neighborhood. And it was something that we had planned on doing before COVID. It was something that, we were thinking it was a light touch way for us to create some content that families might enjoy. And it was something that could be screen free. We hear so much from families about how they are really burned out on screen time. And I just happened to have staff that had experience in storytelling and radio production. And so we went ahead and produced this program, and it was a resounding success. It so far exceeded our expectations of success, surely because so many people were looking for resources, so many families and so many educators looking for different kinds of resources to send home during this time. Next slide. And we ran our, and you can hit the next button again, there'll be some quotes that come up. We did a survey in June after our first season had ended of the podcast. And, we had really hoped that it would be a vehicle for families in a way that a curriculum is a vehicle for teachers to be able to provide language for students. We wanted to do that for families. We wanted to bring issues and language to families in a very, very accessible, age-appropriate, fun. There are fun tidbits for adults as well as kids in there. And based on our survey results, we kind of hit the nail on the head with that. And so we're excited about planning season 2, and I look forward to telling you more about that as we go along. And that is me and my work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mia. And Joe, feel free to queue up your slides while I sort of fill this awkward empty space between one speaker and the next. What I really liked about that, Mia, particularly, was this balance between online and offline, this recognition that, you know, a hybrid learning model is not a synonym for online learning. And that before COVID, we already had parents and educators raising flags around passive engagement with screens. So the need to, especially in a working remotely environment, to have activities that are invitational to conversations that don't involve engagement through a digital means, I think is really exciting and really needed right at the moment. So we'll talk a little bit more about that after we've heard from our other panelists, but thank you again, Mia, for sharing that with us. And fabulous Joe, you've been invited, and we love that slide and can't wait to hear your thoughts around this topic. Joe.
Thanks, Mark. Kia ora, everyone. It's lovely to be back again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Joanne McEachen. I'm the CEO of the Learner First and also on the executive committee for Karanga. So it's a real pleasure to have a chance to talk to you today about some of my other work. This learning, the contribution kit. I've created a contribution kit, and that began from a very unusual beginning. It was actually flying back from Australia after working over there with some of the people that I'm doing some work with in Queensland in the Ministry of Education there. And it happened just as COVID hit. And while I was flying back, I was thinking, how can we help our schools? How can we help parents? How can we help teachers to get through while we're working, while we're not actually on together, and thinking about what are some of the models we've got, what works and what doesn't. So as I was flying back, I was thinking, the work that I've been involved in is really to redesign a new assessment system that really helps teachers to think about how do we let children show what they know in their own way, which really is designed to help with creating an equitable learning experience for kids. Partly it's about when children show what they know in their way, they can then show us what they know in their own context. And when they can show in their own context, they've got much more chance of sharing what they know, and they've got much more confidence in doing so as well. So what happened was I was thinking about that, and I thought, how can we shift that into something that could be done at home rather than just at school? So what I thought about was if we've got something that's happening at school that's really working well, but we don't have access to it at home, what are the ways in which we do that? Firstly, I know that not every student has access to digital tools, so that was one of my things that I was thinking about. Second thing I thought about is not every child is going to be at home. They may be with their parents at work, they may be in a different situation. Another thing I thought about was that there could be some children who are still at school. We've got different kids around the world in different situations. So I had a whole lot of different things racing through my mind. But what the primary thing I was thinking about was around social and emotional learning, meaning that what we're seeing with the youth today is that they know that meaning and fulfillment is really what they're looking for. They're not so much interested in money. I think a lot of our speakers have talked about that today. They've talked about this change in the youth, that they're really seeking to find out who they are, what they know, and what they want to be in their world. And so I thought about when we start to contribute to the world, we start to see some sense of meaning. We start to get out of ourselves and we start to think about what can we do to make a difference. So when I was thinking about that, I thought about, well, how could we have a kit that might help teachers to do this? So I thought about contribution, and I thought about contributive learning, meaning that we could add to the world, and how could we do that at home, at school, online, or anywhere in the world at any time? So if that was the constraints I had, what could we do to create something that would be really meaningful for kids, parents, and teachers? I was also really conscious, though, that when I have been doing a lot of work around wellbeing, that it's the adults that we've been doing a lot of the work with. As many of our speakers have said, it's a lot of the adults that have really struggled to understand the difference between themselves and the learners that they're teaching. And often what we've talked about already is that SEL can be used as a weapon. It can be used in a different way than what we're actually intending it to if we don't have real clear understanding about what we're talking about. So for me, it was really important that we had a tool for teachers to really work with themselves first before they worked with their students. All of this had to happen really quickly because COVID was on top of us. So I have 4 outcomes that I use for the work. One of them is self-understanding, knowing who you are, how you fit into the world, and how you can contribute to humanity. The second one is around connection. How do we connect firstly to ourselves, our families, our community, our school maybe, our region that we live in, and then maybe to the world. And then what's our life purpose? The third one's around knowledge, and what is the knowledge that we each individually need to know for ourselves to be the best person we can be? Not a curriculum that means we have to learn everything from the very beginning all the way through to the end, but what's the actual knowledge I need to be the best person I can be? And then the final one is competency. What are those competencies that will help me learn and return to the world so I can be a contributive learner? So I had all of those things floating around, and then I came up with what was it we needed to do. So I created 10 modules that we could use at home and at school. So today I'm just going to share quickly with you 4 of these modules that really help get going. And these are the outcomes that I talk about. I don't think that there's anywhere in the world that people don't want to know who they are. And I don't think there's anywhere in the world that we don't want to connect. And I don't think there's anywhere in the world that we don't want to know what's important to us. And we all need some sort of competency. So what I tried to do is to make them available for everybody anywhere to use so that they could start to see themselves within this work. So each module has some different sets of questions within them to help people figure out, first of all, themselves. The process I used was that teachers could use this on themselves first. They could first of all ask themselves the questions. They could first of all have a go at doing the work themselves, and then they could send it out to their students and their families. They could do this by phone. They could do this by sending it through technology. They could do this by going and visiting or posting it through the mail. So a variety of ways you could do it, by sitting under a tree, anywhere you wanted to. So I tried to make the questions as broad as we possibly could. So here's an example of one of the question sets that we had that was around identity. So when we're thinking about who am I always think that language, culture, and identity is really critical. So thinking about who we are. The questions are very high level, but you can change them as a teacher to make them to think about who you are and what you want for yourself. So first of all, we have a column around questions to spark your thinking. And I often say that thinking actually is working. Often when children are sitting still and they're not actually engaged in learning, people say, you're not doing anything. But actually, for me, that's often they're contemplating or thinking. So there's a set of questions that help us to really think about it, something. What's your personality? What traits do you like? What traits would you change? So it's really just understanding yourself. Then there's some activities that you might do. And if you're the teacher, you might be doing these yourself first, because sometimes as teachers, we forget to spend some time on ourselves and remember who we are. And as Erin said in our earlier session, that's really dangerous if we don't remember who we are, because we show our biases without realizing it. So this work is really important for us to do as adults first. And I think about some of the activities that will spark our learning. Thinking about an activity like, well, designing a new house to live in that really matches who you are. We have to think about who you are to be able to do an activity like that. And then measurement. I said earlier that I did a whole lot of work around what assessment means and what does it look like. For me, it's really around, I have a theory called authentic mixed method assessment, which looks at a whole lot of qualitative, a whole lot of quantitative, whole ways of knowing about how we're doing and working and learning. It's a mixed method assessment. And so when I look at this, I've created a series of tools that actually help describe what does it look like when we're figuring out who we are. And we make them very simple, and that they can actually, so kids can look at these, teachers can look at these, and adults, parents can look at these and figure out. If I'm just getting started to figure out who I am, that might be where I'm sitting down at the left-hand end. If I'm really trying to work my way up to the other end, how am I going to get there, and what might be my plan to get there? So we provide a small, tiny, tiny, tiny little plan of what I might do to help get there, and some of those questions are going to help me to get there. Teachers didn't necessarily know how to access some of these tools and templates, mainly because it's hard if you haven't done the work on yourself first. So I created a series of other modules that really help us to bring that to life. So the module number 5 was really about how do you create that cultural wellbeing across your class? So if you each individually understand those 4 outcomes, how do you then bring that together as a group of people in the classroom? Then what would be the capabilities you needed as a teacher? What are those? What are they different? What's different about those? For me, it was around being able to partner, being able to engage, being able to develop the contributive outcomes with people. It's about being able to understand who the kids really, really are. And it's about being able to celebrate success and really loving our kids. And the next one was around contributive inquiry. How do we actually inquire into what we're doing and have a cycle? I use the contributive inquiry template with districts, with states, with whole large groups of people when we're looking at planning, as well as all the way through to students who are learning. Last one is collaborative moderation, where we're actually looking at what works for kids And then we're teaching each other what works for kids. So that we're not doing the great big professional development anymore. We're really looking individually what works for this particular child, and I'm going to help share that with other people as well. So for me, it's about creating that community commitment to contributive learning, that we all, if we each can contribute what we're good at, then our world is going to be a great place. What we've tried to do in the past is to everybody try and be good at one or two things, and we've had these goals that we said that we all had to pass and be academic. If we look at social and emotional learning as well as academic, as well as children being healthy and happy, we've got a great society that we could create together. So for me, it's about developing that self-understanding, cultivating knowledge, fostering competency, making connections. And it's about bringing people, not bringing other people down, we're trying to lift everybody up. So I talk about not subtracting from the world, but we're adding to the world. So when we have a crisis, we can stand up to it by contributing. If everybody does, then we can make it through. And so for me, it's about we are what we add. Not what we eat, but what we add. We are what we add to the world. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Virtual round of applause there. Thank you so much, Jo. And while we get Karen to sort of queue up her slides, I'll just make a couple of quick comments and observations from that. That was great. And number one, thank you for your contribution, to the conversation here. And I loved the sort of the both protective and preventive and developmental kind of intent behind the resources that have been built. And certainly when you made reference that the lived experiences for young people and their families and communities across the globe, and certainly within countries, not just between countries, is many and varied. This is both a humanitarian crisis and economic crisis, and education is sitting right smack bang in the middle of these sort of tectonic forces at the moment. I loved the learn and return piece there that you mentioned as well, that again, coming back to, I know what sort of is first and foremost to you, which is around what can you contribute beyond yourself? How do we shift from me to we? I love that. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the fabulous Karen. Karen's an associate professor at the University College of London Institute of Education. She's conducted her research in over 30 countries around education policy. So she is officially a policy guru around generations, super interesting, leadership, gender and equity. And in addition to sort of living through the transition to online life of a university, and I had the opportunity to interview a university student yesterday and ask him, this young man, this question around what's been your lived experience doing this. Fascinating. You've also been at home as a solo parent of a fabulous, awesome 9-year-old. So you've had the experience of work from home and learn from home, where the boardroom and the kitchen are both interchangeable entities, and there is no privacy, and the garbage truck is going to come right when you're in the middle of that really important call. We all know it and we've lived it. So a warm welcome to you, Karen, and also welcome to the Karanga steering committee too, I believe. So we're delighted to have your voice on that committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going slide free. We're going old school.
Outrageous.
I know. So I have spent, I'm Canadian by accent, which is what I will usually say, and I'm British and Canadian by birth. So you will probably hear some squealing in the background. There's some extraordinary learning going on. I have said, please be quiet. It is 10:15 at night, and I have a 9-year-old who's playing Fortnite. So it's extraordinary parenting. However, there's a few things I think that may be helpful in terms of reflections and thinking about hybridity and where we are at the moment. So as Mark said, I am an academic. I spend probably 80% of my time as a nerd, which means I'm at home and I'm used to working sort of wherever my brain is, which makes it relatively easy. However, when I work from home most of the time, I'm used to it being quiet or being able to go somewhere where the noise is very predictable. So I have had to relearn how to work in an environment where I have a 9-year-old whose squeals and delights and joys and ups and downs is completely unpredictable. But there were a few things I wanted to touch on that I think might be interesting. There's a few things that I've been asked to do lately that have made me really, really think about what the notion of hybrid learning means for me as an academic. So I was scheduled to be in Shanghai for a visiting professorship where we were launching a set of global studies on leadership. I was then supposed to be in Qatar, where I'm running the Masters in Leadership program there. And the biggest challenge is that we've had to actually stop that program in its tracks. In Qatar, you actually can only do a maximum amount of learning online. So it's caused us to have to throw the model completely up in the air. And given that what we usually teach around leadership development and research methods is very strongly linked to a set of socio-emotional skills that people will be developing to be able to do their jobs properly, I've had to completely rethink how I deliver content and the kind of skills and assessment that I will put into place. So I think I might actually give my doctoral students some of Joanne's contribution kit. Somebody earlier said you would treat somebody differently who was a kid, who is as an adult. And in most of my teaching and my work, I pretty much treat everybody the same way, which could either be petrifying for the children or celebratory for the adults. What I found the most interesting, though, is that there's been so much judgment and so much of the front ending of discussions about equity. And when I think about the skills that I want my son to learn as he comes out of this, not Fortnite, just so you know, it's about the skills of not judging other people. And what's been the most difficult thing for me is that everyone is making assumptions about what everyone else's life is like. And I think what this does for us in terms of SEL is gives us an opportunity to sort of crack open the kind of judgments that people are making all the time that we usually just let go under the carpet. So one of the things that I've done recently is I spend a chunk of my time being Isaac's mom, where we do all sorts of things. At the moment, we've embarked on a Big Bang Theory marathon, which is delightful. Usually the naughty jokes go over his head, so we're fine. We've learned a lot about Mario Kart, but he's assured me that one of the things he's learned during lockdown has been he's fine-tuned his negotiation skills. Now, what's been interesting is we decided when we locked down that we were going to learn about listening and listening theory. We've learned about close communication bias, which I thought was going to be excellent. However, it's turned out to be the biggest mistake I've ever made. I learned about it and taught him about it as we were developing resources for leaders, because I thought as we move into the hybrid space, people are going to have to be much better listeners and much less biased in how they consume information. What happened was I have a 9-year-old who will now call me on close communication bias if I cut him off before he's finished his statement. So what we've found in our house is we've actually been doing less of the prescribed teaching work that's come from the school, but much more work with him assisting me in developing leadership core competencies. So when Karanga called and asked if I would sit on the steering committee, I thought it was an excellent justification for how I've been homeschooling, which is basically only socio-emotional learning and not really content and curriculum. So what I've done in support of teachers is we developed something that we're calling our pandemic privilege audit. And one of the things that I've heard from a lot of the teachers we work with is they are absolutely shattered. They're delivering information at school. In England, we still have most of our schools open, and they were open throughout the entire lockdown for kids of key workers, which means the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, delivery drivers. And those were the people who were most likely to get sick. So our teachers have been really on the front line, but simultaneously, many of them have been delivering hybrid learning at home. So they've had their own children at home, often teaching them. They've been teaching my child who's been at home, but they've also been going into school and teaching as well. So we're now coming into our summer. Our summer break doesn't start for another 3 weeks. And the biggest challenge that we have is that our teachers are absolutely exhausted. But the exhaustion is not unilateral. And there's been so much informal judgment that people have placed on each other. So people will say to me that my time at home has been really easy because I only have one child. And I will very quickly, and I've learned not to sneer and, let my teeth show, is that I've been on my own for 13 and a half weeks with a 9-year-old. And my family is in another country. And we have been pretty much all by ourselves. But that is not as difficult as some of
Is that just a momentary pause of Karen? Okay, Karen, I'm not sure whether you can hear us. My assumption is that Karen has frozen for everyone. Feel free to let me know in the chat pane or one of the other panelists come off mute and let me know that I'm not the one frozen.
It's not you, Mark. It looks
There we go. That's always good to know. Okay, we'll let Karen, I think she's probably going to drop off and drop back on again. Maybe the 9-year-old had some urgent pressing question around, you know, what were the right ingredients to combine together to make hydrogen gas, which apparently is very easy to make if you're 9 with aluminium foil, warm water and baking and washing soda crystals. I can tell you from experience, it's perfect. You can make hydrogen gas just like that, and it's highly explosive. I'll tell you the story one day of what happened with a grade 2 class and that little failed experiment. There you go, Karen. That was just me filling the spot, doing a little bit of soft shoe shuffle. You'd like to come off mute, and there you go. Back to you.
You should have heard the panic that the fortnight also shut down at the same time.
That's almost the end of, you know, the world as we know it.
I don't know what's worse. So I think that I just wanted to finish. I'm not quite sure where I got sort of cut off, but I think for us, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the equity implications of hybrid learning and the equity implications of what it's going to mean for people to learn at home. It's not just for the students, and my work focuses mostly on teachers and leaders. And what we're forgetting is that, especially in our cities, the work that our teachers do is going to change dramatically, but where they do their work is also going to change. So many of our younger teachers living in cities are living with flatmates or roommates. Many of our teachers are living with multiple family members. So the space that we all have to execute our work is radically different. And then what that means for mental health and well-being is different. So I am incredibly optimistic, and listening to the session before about any resources that we can give to parents that can help bridge that gap between parents and teachers, that can help them have better conversations at home that will make their lives better. Because at the end of the day, that I think is the biggest possible game we can make. So while it's changed our teaching, it's changed our life, it's changed our travel, I think the opportunity for us to come together better in terms of how we treat each other, not judging each other as much, I think that's where the SEL community has the most to contribute, and we have the most to gain.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Karen, for that. And the key bits I jotted down here in my little notepad was, you know, I love the fact that you kind of brought up the squeals, the joy, and the ups and downs. You know, it's true that we create and we recreate our reality through the language that we choose. And as I was listening to you at the start, you know, you were choosing very intentionally appreciative language. Sure, you weren't ignoring that the experience of being trapped with a 9-year-old, you know, for 13 weeks, you know, certainly would present its challenges. But it was interesting how you chose to tell the story. And I think sitting within that is a lesson within itself around whether people want to call it, you know, growth mindset, or people want to call it, you know, around having an appreciative lens. But we create and recreate our reality with the language that we choose to tag, you know, around it. The other thing that you mentioned was around, you know, cracking open assumptions. And I thought that was really interesting, the bridging the gap. And the other bit that I kind of focused in on, I just love that bit about, you know, with your son, whether you fine-tuned his power of negotiation and somehow managed to create a sensitive new age manipulator who now has got the language and the tools to be able to put a position and navigate around what it is he's being asked to do or not to do. No more fortnight. Okay, let's sit down and talk about this, Mum. Let's jump into the panel part. You guys have all touched on this, around this kind of shifting education landscape, education reimagined from traditional, it's sitting in remote in many places at the moment still. In many places, it's back to school, it's staggered back to school, it's different school days, it's different age levels. Young children in Edinburgh, you know, the children of emergency service workers sit and eat alone at lunch tables because they've gone back to school. To allow their parents to continue their frontline work. You know, we know in Paris, a kindergartner arrives for their first day at kindergarten to be temperature checked, sanitized and masked on, kindergarten day 1. You know, we know that, you know, in Wuhan, it's opened up, the students are back at school, but we're eating lunch behind plastic shields, isolated from one another. It's not a return to normal, it's a return to abnormal. So, you know, as we move into a little bit of just an open panel discussion, just keeping an eye on the time, one of the questions that's come through on the Q&A pane really kind of picks up this sense of what are the skills and dispositions that have suddenly risen to the surface. You've all touched on them, but it'd be nice to sort of name them and claim them. What are the skills and dispositions that young people seem to be needing at the moment to be successful in navigating the now and the next? So do we want to kick that off with, we'll go in order, and maybe Mia, if you wanted to kick that off with a thought, and then we can jump around.
Yeah, I think there's several. I'm just going to go ahead and start with one, because we're working on the first episode of our new podcast for our, you know, in the US, what would be considered back to school, the August framework. And we thought about all the constellation of things and looking at the report that our research team had done, thinking about the executive function skills that are super important, you know, for kids, whether they're in school, whether they're at home. And one of the things that we thought would be important for young kids in particular is this idea of flexibility and being able to deal with things that are different than you expected, or things that, you know, used to be one way and now they're another way. And so we're working around storytelling. The sort of the conceit around this story that we're working on is that there is, in the imagined neighborhood, a day called Blurg's Day, and you don't know when that day is going to be. It's just some day, it's all of a sudden it's Blurg's Day and things are not like you expected. It rains rubber chickens, you know, no gravity, you know, thing, and you can't prepare for it. You just don't know what it's going to be, but you got to kind of roll with it. And what are the things that you can do to help yourself when things are unexpected? So this is kind of, we're trying to give educators and parents some fun and easy ways. We usually try and put like a little hook, like a little language hook in there that they can refer back to when it's like, oh man, this is like a Blurg's Day.
Right, I love that. I love the dealing with change and ambiguity, and also the, you know, when it comes to developing emotional granularity, how you could use that activity to actually start to, you know, develop the depth of vocabulary around emotion to describe how you might feel experiencing that and shifting from that. What about you, Joe? What are your thoughts around this this sort of skill disposition area?
I'd say the first thing for me, Mark, is around self-understanding, knowing who you are. So for me, being from a bicultural country, I think about whenever we introduce ourselves, I usually start in Māori, and we identify who I am, where I'm from, what my family is, and that grounds us. It gives us an identity, and we know who we are. We go, oh yeah, you're from there. Oh, you're from there. You're from there. There's an understanding of ourselves. And when you stand tall in who you are, you can then talk to anybody else. You can manage things that happen that are different. You can deal with things because you know yourself and you know how you're going to react. I think often we learn at school, we go straight into learning outside of ourselves. We learn about maths and science and history and social, all the things that's outside of ourselves, but we don't go inside. Who are we? What do we believe in? What do we love? What do we value? So for me, it's about self-understanding first before anything else.
Okay. Good one. Yep. So self-awareness, that grounded in identity. Karen, you've touched on already, I think, some of the key bits here. I was really intrigued about this intentional teaching, if you like, you know, of your son around some really important aspects of learning. But you know, what do you think just generally around what are the skills bubbling to the top as being most critical for success?
It's really interesting. I think for many of them, they've come from the home. And I think part of it would be around there's a set of conditions that almost serve as a pressure release valve. And very quickly, one of the things that we did, and this is something I do with my students, is try and find a way that if things get a bit stressful, so we do a lot of group work, a lot of sort of flipped learning, if something gets stressful and complicated, that there's a solution, and there's a tagline, there's a language, and you fix it. With Isaac, my son, he came up with that when things get a bit stressful, he wanted me to give him a cuddle, which is fine. He called it a pocket. So he made me a pocket in bed when he wanted me to cuddle. And so now at any point during the day, if things get a bit stressful, he will scream, pocket. And that means that we go and lie down and talk. And the second thing that happens is that I can tell and he can tell if one of us is stressed out. We've actually just got to the point where instead of having these long convoluted conversations, which are helpful, one of us will just say, just name your feeling. Just name your feeling. And then we can get on with dealing with it. And I think we've tried to do that with levity. We've also done it by lifting the no swearing rule. You're not allowed to swear at someone and you can't swear in anger. But we've tried really carefully, and it helps when Mum's an organizational development scholar, but we've tried to create some conditions where it's obvious that this is not normal, because you can swear like a trucker, no offense to truckers in the house. But you also, like, he came up with the pocket on his own, and it was his lure to get me to cuddle him when I had to work. And now we have a language where it's just like, just name the feeling. We can talk about what to do about it, but we don't want to spend all the time trying to pull out the feeling and have no time to talk. So I think it's that, for me, with any sort of organizational change, it's about language and shortcuts.
Yeah, I
and
like
about identifying a set of things that everybody it's like Blur's Day. We've taken Blur's Day into the house, and it's a pocket. You talk about your feelings. And I do that with adults too. I think it's been really helpful. The concept of pocket, I thought, was genius. He would try and turn that into more V-Bucks on Fortnite, but that has not happened.
Okay. That's that power of negotiation. I think one of the key things that you've touched on there, Karen, is just that importance of rehearsal. One of the things I'd heard about remote learning, one of the successful practices that came out of the UK Endowment Fund research was around, when students and the teachers and the parents had an opportunity to rehearse and practice what participation looked like in, let's say, an online environment, without the baggage and the pressure of having to deliver some cognitive outcome, they were more successful because they practiced and rehearsed behavior and response. They learned the language to wrap around it. And I love the kind of comment you made there around the shortcutting at times, the emotional part, because at times we don't have time for an extraordinarily long game of detective feelings. Sometimes it's much more efficient, and as Mark Bracker would say, you've got to name it to tame it. And then you can unpack and unstick it, because everybody has the biological drive to be seen and to be heard. It's what humans desire and are motivated by. We're going to wrap up. It's been a super duper panel. I'd really like to thank you, Mia, Karen, and Jojo, for your engagement in the panel and your insights. People have got your contact details that can reach out to you and continue along in the text chat. People are filling that at the moment with love, especially those who have got 9-year-olds. In wrapping up, a comment that I would just make to everybody on the call or joining on demand through the Karanga YouTube channel, is go easy on yourself. Whatever you've done this week so far, whatever you've done today, just let that be enough, because it is. So I'm Mark Sparvell. It's been my pleasure to moderate this panel. I'm going to cast over in the Brady Bunch boxes now to this gentleman that's possibly below me, Mr. Louka. Mr. Louka, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you to everybody that just shared their insights. I have just joined for the last half an hour or so, having really been at the opening of this conference and now, of course, the ending. And I think this is effectively, really speaks to what Karanga is trying to be, which is a global alliance for social emotional learning and life skills. And so it's my pleasure to try to weave together what has been effectively 10 hours of continuous content and deep discussion. And so to do so, I just want to try to call upon some of the really powerful ideas that have been shared across some of the different sessions today. We have had some really clear themes, and they have been designed quite intentionally to try to respond to this incredible moment in our collective human history. I mean, I do wonder in 5 years' time, wherever we happen to be in our world, what we'll think about the year that was 2020. If we were to futurecast into that particular space and, picking up some of the wonderful things that Jojo, that Karen and Mia and Mark have shared with us, just in this most recent panel about hybrid learning, what do we want our young people to remember? How are we going to support, the incredibly hardworking teachers that are exhausting now? In fact, I think it's fair to say that there is a collective fatigue about how we respond and how we triage, not just learning, but also health systems as we continue to respond to the pandemic. There is this wonderful moment in our collective history, however, which is, what is the opportunity for us all? And with all the talk of crisis and lockdown and shutdown and shelter in place and social distancing, there's also a great pause. And in some senses, it's also a great reckoning. What is it we want to pay attention to? Be that in a classroom, be that at home, be that within a school, within a learning ecosystem, within an education system, within a society, within a country, and ultimately within our global community. And across all the different conversations that we've had today, from 15 different countries represented in terms of people that have been sharing from primarily our steering committee here at Karanga, but also well beyond that, that I think is the collective opportunity we have. Which parts of normal do we no longer serve us? How might we reimagine, try to redesign the learning experience, but also ultimately, what success means for us through education and through our collective work in all of the different societies in which we come. So to give you a little bit of background about Karanga, we are a very new project. We have kind of emerged out of the Salzburg Global Seminar, and we are a very committed and passionate community. And so, obviously we think, and Dominic shared this earlier in the closing of session 1, this wonderful quote that is misattributed to Victor Hugo, of course, which is, there is something more powerful than the brute force of bayonets. It is the idea whose time has come and hour has struck. And if we can say anything about social and emotional learning and the incredible decades of work that people have been doing all over the world in trying to support the most human experience possible for learners and for communities, it is that time is now. How do we seize this collective opportunity to centralize a focus on the things that make us the most human, on who we are, as Joanne has just taken us through, on focusing on the social emotional, as Karen has talked about with Izzy, her son at home. What did we want? What is success for all of us? And how do we create, healthier, more vibrant, and in that case, better societies? I think back to a panel at the beginning of today, and we've had some amazing insights. And this came from Stephanie Jones, who's been doing some wonderful work for a long time at the Easel Lab. And she said, where social justice and where social emotional learning intersect is that we want to educate the whole child for all children. And that idea of us all being in this together has been a constant theme picked up, be that in the hybrid models that we might use to try to engage and empower our young people, and frankly, all of us as learners as well. But also, what is the society that we're fighting for? We have had so many different organizations involved. We want to say an enormous thank you, particularly to some of those that backed some of the early work and the ideas about this global community. How might we share, our emerging work, our emerging strategies, to organizations like Microsoft, QFI, and ETS, who have been supported for the last few years. We are a relatively young initiative, but we want to try to connect, curate, and drive action across learning systems around the globe. There's this beautiful sentiment, which I shared in session 1, which seems like a lifetime ago. And it comes from a wonderful activist here in Australia, Lola Watson. And she says, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And of course, the sense of Karanga, as Joanne may have mentioned, it's a concept which is a call out in welcome, a call from the heart. And we wanted to be able to reflect that this is, we think, a time of global awakening. It is the time of collective opportunity. And if we do this well and connect our best ideas together, we think we can make some really remarkable change so that the new normal that Mark spoke to actually is better than the old normal, not just for some, but for all. We would love you to join our movement. It's a very simple sign up on the website at karanga.org. We also have the wonderful professional practice that takes place in Facebook, Karanga SEL, it's the Facebook page, and the practice is SEL in EDU. You can join with us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, really, and we'd love to hear from you in terms of how you are trying to humanize the educational experience for all, and ensure that we are not racing back to the particular parts of our work that doesn't serve us best. So from me here on Kaurna country in South Australia, on behalf of all of us, I would like to say an enormous thank you for joining us. An enormous thank you to everyone who has spoken and shared their insights, and be that a part of the session one and all the different speakers from our keynote speakers, our SEL and social justice, all of the different conversations that we've had. And I would like to close out before handing to Matt is with one of the favorite quotes about education that comes from the German philosopher Hannah Arendt. And really, this is our collective opportunity. Education is the point at which we decide if we love the world enough to take responsibility for it. And so in this collective moment, how might we love our world, take responsibility for it, not just reimagine what's possible, but also take the action that's required so that we have all children experiencing the most empowering education possible. Thank you so much, and a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to wherever you happen to be on our world.
All right, thank you very much, Louka. That was great. You did a great job at a tall order of summing up what's been an incredible day of learning and sharing amongst this great community of social emotional learning champions. But the day is not quite over yet. Just want to remind everybody that we have one last session happening, and it's happening in a different corner of Zoom. We've got our second session of the Knowledge Hook seminar coming up, and it's going to be you see the link down there on the page, or if you want to go and if you haven't registered yet to join, you can go register to join right now, and they'll be starting off in just a few minutes. So you got a little time to take a little bit of a break. With that being said, I just want to say it's on behalf of Committee for Children, it's been a pleasure to be able to play our small part in bringing this conference to everyone today. And I am really looking forward to doing this again. There's going to be, this is not the last Karanga. There's going to be another one happening in early October, the week of October 5th. Stay tuned for more information from karanga.org and SEL and education community. We'll be making sure that you all know about what's coming as it comes. So with that, I just want to, I want to thank you all for attending today, because really, what would this be without all y'all being here? And I really appreciate it. So y'all have a good day, morning, evening. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you all on Facebook or next October. Thank you so much.
Right. And I think we should all put a virtual clap in the chat pane for Mr. Matt Pearsall for his amazing technical prowess across this enormous day. So if you're still here and you haven't dropped off, yeah, pop an applause in there, because he's been the person behind the scenes spinning the discs in this this epic musical production today. Thanks, Matt.